Part 3. The White World Revolution. Subsection 10. This, then, is the look of the age of world wars, at the beginning of which we find ourselves standing. But behind it appears the second element of the mighty upheaval, the world revolution. What does it want? In what does it consist? What does the word at the very bottom mean? We are as far from understanding its full content today as from grasping the historical significance of the First World War, which lies behind us. It is not, as half of us think, a question of the threat to economic existence from the Bolshevism of Moscow, nor, as the other half think, of the, quote, liberation, unquote, of the working class. These are only surface questions. In the first place, this revolution is not a merely impending threat. We are in the midst of it, and not since yesterday or today, but since more than a century ago. It crosses the, quote, horizontal, unquote, struggle between states and nations by a vertical between the ruling classes of the white nations and the others. And in the background, the far more dangerous second part of this revolution has already set in. The whites in general are under attack by the collective mass of the, quote, colored, unquote, population of the earth, which is slowly becoming conscious of its community. This struggle is being waged not only between strata of humanity, but also between strata of the spiritual life, right down to the individuals. Almost every one of us has this opposition of thought and feeling in him, though without being conscious of it. That is why so few arrive at seeing clearly on which side they stand. But that very fact shows the inward necessity of this decision, which reaches far beyond one's personal desires and activities. There is very little to be gained out of the catchwords derived from the way of thinking that prevails at the moment, such as Bolshevism, communism, class struggle, capitalism, socialism, each of which is believed by the user to convey the exact meaning of the problem, simply because he is unable to see deep down into the facts. The same thing has occurred in all former cultures at the equivalent stage, little as we know of the details. But in the case of the classical age, we do know enough. The climax of the revolutionary movement lies in the period between the Gracchi and Sulla, but the struggle set in a good century earlier with C. Flaminius, whose agrarian law of 232 Polybius rightfully describes as the beginning of the demoralization of the masses. This development was only temporarily interrupted and diverted by the war against Hannibal, towards the end of which slaves were drafted to the citizen army. From the time of the murder of the Gracchi and of their great opponent, the younger Scipio Africanus, the power of ancient Roman tradition to preserve the state dwindled rapidly. Marius, a man of the lower classes, and not even of Roman origin, created the first army that was based not on universal conscription, but on the recruitment of paid volunteers who were personally attached to him, and proceeded with this army to launch a pitiless and sanguinary attack on the fundamental relationships in Rome. The older generations, trained for centuries in the statesmanship and sense of moral responsibility that had given Rome its position as a world power, were to a large extent exterminated. The Roman Sertorius attempted to found a rival state in Spain with the aid of the barbarous races there, and Spartacus roused the slaves of Italy to wipe out all that Rome meant. The war against Jugurtha and the Catilinarian conspiracy revealed the deterioration of the ruling classes themselves, whose uprooted elements were prepared at any moment to appeal to the country's enemy and the mob of the Forum in support of their sordid financial interests. Sallust was perfectly right. It was for the sake of cash, whereof the mob and the rich speculators were equally greedy, that the honor and greatness of Rome, its race and its idea, went down in ruin. But this cosmopolitan mass of people, which had swarmed into the city from all sides, was, just as is the case now, not mobilized and organized from within to fight for its right of self-government, its, quote, liberation, unquote, from the oppression of the ruling classes, but from without, as a means to the ends of business politicians and professional revolutionaries. From these circles there emerged, as today, the dictatorship from below, which is the inevitable final result of radical democratic anarchy. Polybius, with his experience of statesmanship and his keen eye for the trends of events, foretold this with certainty 30 years before C. Gracchus. Quote, "So when they begin to lust for power, and cannot attain it through themselves or their own good qualities, they ruin their estates, tempting and corrupting the people in every possible way. And hence, when by their foolish thirst for reputation they have created among the masses an appetite for gifts and the habit of receiving them, democracy in its turn is abolished and changes into a rule of force and violence. For the people, having grown accustomed to feed at the expense of others, and to depend for their livelihood on the property of others, as soon as they find a leader who is enterprising but is excluded from the honors of office by his penury, institute the rule of violence, and now uniting their forces massacre, banish, and plunder, until they degenerate again into perfect savages, and find once more a master and monarch. And for this change, for the worse, the populace will be responsible when, on the one hand, they think they have a grievance against certain people who have shown themselves grasping, and when, on the other hand, they are puffed up by the flattery of others who aspire to office. For now, stirred to fury and swayed by passion in all their counsels, they will no longer consent to obey or even be the equals of the ruling caste, but will demand the lion's share for themselves. When this happens, the state will change its name to the finest sounding of all, freedom and democracy, but will change its nature to the worst thing of all, mob rule." Unquote. This dictatorship is for the white races of today not a mere threat. We are already completely under its sway, and moreover so submerged and so assured of its normality that we do not even notice it. The, quote, dictatorship of the proletariat, unquote, that is, of its profiteers, the trade unions and party officials of all tendencies, is an accomplished fact, whether governments are actually formed by them or, owing to the timidity of the, quote, bourgeoisie, unquote, are dominated by them. This condition was what Marius aimed at, but failed to obtain, owing to entire want of statesmanlike ability. But what he lacked, his nephew Caesar possessed, and in full measure. He brought down the terrible period of the Revolution to an end by his form of, quote, dictatorship from above, unquote, which set the unlimited authority of a superior personality in the place of partisan anarchy. It was a form to which he gave his name for all time. His murder and its consequences could not affect it in any way. From his reign onward, the struggle is waged no longer for gold or to gratify class hatred, but solely for the possession of absolute power. With the fight between capitalism and socialism, it has nothing to do. On the contrary, the class of big financiers and speculators, the Roman equites, a term which since Mommsen has quite erroneously been translated, quote, knights, unquote, always had a perfectly good understanding with the populace and its organizations, the voting clubs, the soldatia, and the armed bands like those of Milo and Clodius. They supplied the money for elections, insurrections, and bribes, and C. Gracchus, in return, handed over to them the provinces for unlimited exploitation under state protection. There they spread incredible misery by plundering, usury, and the selling of whole towns into slavery. To crown all, they took possession of the law courts, where they were able to sit in judgment of their own crimes and acquit each other. They, for the most part, promised the dictator everything, only to drop him and his well-meant reforms as soon as they had secured their own advantages. This alliance between stock exchange and trade unions exists now as then. It is part of the natural evolution of such periods, arising as it does from a common hatred of state authority and of the leaders of productive economy, the two obstacles in the way of the anarchic principle of effortless money-making. Marius, a political simpleton like so many popular leaders, and his backers Saturninus and Cinna, thought no differently from Gracchus, and therefore Sulla, the dictator of the nationalist side, after a storming of Rome, organized a terrible butchery amongst the financiers, from which, as a class, they never recovered. After Caesar, they completely disappeared from history as a political element. Their existence as a political power was intimately bound up with the age of Democratic Party anarchy, and did not survive it. Subsection 11. This revolution of more than a century in duration has fundamentally nothing to do with economics. It is a long disintegration period in the life of the culture as a whole, considered as a living body. The inward form of the life falls to pieces, and with it goes the power to give it outward expression through the creative works which collectively form the history of states, religions, and arts, after that power has matured to its extreme limits. The individual man with his private existence follows the trend of the whole. His doings, his attitudes, intentions, thoughts, experiences, inevitably form an element, however small, in this development. If he confuses this with purely economic questions, it is already a sign of the decay that is going forward within himself too, whether he feels it and knows it or not. It goes without saying that economic forms are just as much a part of civilization as states, religions, ideas, and arts. But what is commonly meant by economics is not the form of economic life that grow up and wither independently of human will, but the material product of economic activity, which nowadays is simply equated in the meaning of civilization and history, and the decline of which is regarded materialistically and mechanistically as the quote, cause unquote, and content of the world catastrophe. The scene of this revolution in life, its foundation, and at the same time its expression, is the megalopolis, which is found arising in the late period of all cultures. Into this world of stone and petrifaction flock ever-growing crowds of peasant folk, uprooted from the land, the masses in the terrifying sense, formless human sand from which artificial and therefore fleeting figures can be kneaded. Parties, organizations modeled on program and ideal, but in which that inherent power of growth that the course of the generations had saturated with tradition, and that most of all expresses itself in the fruitfulness of all life, the instinct for permanence of family and race, is extinct. An abundance of children, the chief sign of a healthy race, becomes tiresome and absurd. This is the gravest sign of the egoism of the metropolitans, who have themselves become atoms, of the egoism which is the opposite not of the present-day collectivism. Between those two there is no difference. A pile of atoms is no more alive than a single one, but of the urge to live on, in the blood of posterity, in the creative care for it, in the lastingness of the name. Cold intelligence, on the other hand, that solitary bloom, the weed of the pavements, sprouts in incredible masses. It is no longer the thrifty, deep wisdom of old peasant families, which remains true as long as the stock to which it belongs endures, but the mere intelligence of the day, of the daily papers, ephemeral literature, and national assemblies, the bloodless intellect whose criticism gnaws everything away that is left standing of the genuine, that is, the naturally grown, culture. For the culture is a growth. The more perfectly a nation represents, shows the true stamp and style of its culture, and amongst the noblest creations of a culture are its nations themselves. The richer its organic disposition by status and rank, and the more genuine the respective distances between ranks, from the strong-rooted peasantry to the urban patriciate. Here is the high level of form, tradition, training, and custom, innate superiority in the ruling families, circles, and personalities, signify the life, the destiny of the whole. A society, in this sense, remains untouched by rational classifications and visions, or else it has ceased to exist. Above all, it is constituted according to rank and not economic classes. The latter, the material, English point of view, which is developed with and by the growth of rationalism since Adam Smith, and was formulated in a shallow and cynical system by Marx a century or so ago, is not made any more right by the fact that it has won out to this moment, when it dominates the entire thought, vision, and will of the white nations. It is a sign of the decline of society, and nothing more. Before this century is through, men will ask themselves in amazement how this valuation of social forms and degrees on the basis of employer and employed, that is, according to the amount of money that the individual has or intends to have as fortune, income, and wages, ever came to be taken seriously. It is the standpoint of proletarians and parvenus, who are at bottom one and the same type, the same weed of a metropolitan pavement, from the thief and tub-thumping agitator to the speculator in stocks or party advantage. But, quote, society, unquote, implies having culture, having form, down to the least detail of manners and thoughts, a code that has been built up by long discipline over whole generations, a strict moral outlook on life, which penetrates the whole of existence with 1,000 unspoken and rarely conscious obligations and ties, but through them forms all members of society into a living unit, often irrespective of national frontiers, as was the case with the nobility of the Crusades and that of the 18th century. This it is that determines rank. This is what is meant by belonging to society. Among Germanic races it is called, almost mystically, honor. This honor was a force which permeated the lives of whole generations. Personal honor was only the sense of unqualified responsibility of the individual for the social honor, the professional honor, the national honor. The individual shared the life of the community, and the existence of the others was at the same time his own. Whatever he did, the responsibility was shared by all who came after him. And in those days, it was not only a man's spirit that died when he was dishonored, when his own or his family's sense of honor had been mortally wounded, whether by his own fault or a stranger's. Everything that we call duty, the basis of all genuine rights, the original substance of every sort of dignity, may be traced back to honor. The peasantry and every kind of handicraftsman, the merchant and the officer, the civil servant and the prince of ancient lineage, all have their honor. Those who have it not, those who, quote, see no point in, unquote, maintaining the decencies vis-a-vis themselves as well as others, are, quote, vulgar, unquote. This is the opposite of nobility, according to the code of every true society, and not poverty or want of money, as envious beings suppose today, when all instinct for superior living and feeling has been lost, and the public manners of all classes and parties are equally debased. Into the old aristocratic society of Western Europe, which by the end of the 18th century had reached a level of existence and refinement of form which could not be surpassed, and was already becoming fragile and sickly in certain respects, the successful Anglo-Puritan bourgeoisie thrust its shoots into the 1840s. Its ambition was to vie with the nobility in its mode of life, and if possible to be merged into it. In this absorption of new currents of human life, one sees how strong these forms of ancient growth were. The planters in Spanish South America and English North America had long since formed a true aristocracy on the model of the Spanish grandee and the English lord. The second of these groups was annihilated in the Civil War of 1861 and replaced by the parvenus of New York and Chicago and their revenues from capital milliards. Later, from 1870 onwards, the new German bourgeoisie spread itself into the strict life of the Prussian officer and official class. But this is the very essence of social existence, that which rises to higher rank by its own ability and its inward force must be disciplined and ennobled by this rigid form and its unconditioned ethic, if it is thenceforth to represent it, and hand it down to posterity in sons and grandsons. A live society renews itself perpetually by precious blood which pours into it from below and outside. The capacity of the living form to take in, refine, and assimilate, without becoming unsure in the process, is a test of its strength. But as soon as this form of life becomes anything but self-evident, or even takes notice of critics who dispute the need for its existence, it is all up with it. For then one loses the sight of necessity, of a structure that assigns to every sort of person and human activity their place in the life of a whole. The realization of the essential unlikeness, inequality, of the part that is identical with organic formulation. One ceases to have a clear conscience as to one's own rank, and forgets how to meet subordination as a matter of course. But to the same extent, the lower orders forget, only as a consequence of this, to practice this subordination, and to recognize it as necessary and justified. Here, as always, revolution begins from above, only to make way presently for revolts from below. Quote, universal, unquote, rights have, from time immemorial, been given to those who have not even thought of claiming them. but society rests upon the inequality of men. That is a natural fact. There are strong and weak natures, natures born to lead or not to lead, creative and untalented, honorable, lazy, ambitious, and placid natures. Each has its place in the general order of things. The more significant the culture, the more it resembles the structure of a noble animal or vegetable body, and the greater are the differences between its constituent elements. The differences, not the contrasts, for these are only introduced by reasoning. No good retainer dreams of regarding peasants as his equals, and every foreman who knows his job refuses to allow unskilled laborers to address him on terms of equality. This is the natural feeling in human relations. Equal rights are contrary to nature, are an indication of the departure from the type of aging societies, are the beginning of their irrevocable decline. It is a piece of intellectual stupidity to want to substitute something else for the social structure that has grown up through the centuries and is fortified by tradition. There is no substituting anything else for life. After life, there is only death. And that, at bottom, is the intention. We do not seek to alter and improve, but to destroy. In every society, degenerate elements sink constantly to the bottom. Exhausted families, downfall on members of generation of high breed, spiritual and physical failures and inferiors. One has only to glance at the figures in meetings, public houses, processions, and riots. One way or another, they are all abortions, men who, instead of having healthy instincts in their body, have only heads full of disputatiousness and revenge for their wasted life, and mouths as their most important organ. It is the dregs of great cities, the genuine mob, the underworld in every sense, which everywhere constitute the opposition to the great and noble world, and unite in their hatred of it. Political and literary bohemia, wastrel nobility, Catiline and Philippe Égalité, Duke of Orleans, shipwrecked academians, adventurers and speculators, criminals and prostitutes, loiterers and the feeble-minded, mixed with a few pathetic enthusiasts for some abstract ideal, a mushy desire for revenge for some bad luck that has spoiled their lives, the absence of any instinct of honor and duty, and an unlimited thirst for money without work and for rights without responsibilities bring them together. It is from this befogged milieu that the heroes of the moment of all popular movements and radical parties arise. Here the word, quote, liberty, unquote, takes on the bloody significance that it has in the declining ages. What is meant is liberation from all the bonds of civilization, from every kind of form and custom, from all the people whose mode of life they feel in their dull fury to be superior. Pride in quietly borne poverty, silent fulfillment of duty, renunciation for the sake of a task or conviction, greatness in enduring one's fate, loyalty, honor, responsibility, achievement. All this is a constant reproach to the, quote, humiliated and insulted, unquote. For, once more let it be said, the opposite of noble is not poor, but vulgar. The debased thought and feeling of this underworld makes use of the uprooted masses of great cities, who no longer trust their own instincts, in order to achieve their own ends, and gratify their desires of revenge and destruction. That is why this helpless crowd is so persistently inoculated by the spoken and written word, with, quote, class consciousness, unquote, and class hatred, and why the ruling classes, the rich and powerful, are shown, in direct inversion of their real significance, as criminals and exploiters, until finally the accusers offer themselves as saviors and leaders. All of the, quote, people's rights, unquote, the discussion of which was started from above by sick consciences and loose rationalist thinking, are now demanding as a matter of course from below by the disinherited, never for the people. For they have always been given to those who had never thought of asking for them and do not know what to do with them. Neither is it desired that they should, for these rights are not meant for the, quote, people, unquote, but for the dregs of the self-designated, quote, people's representatives, unquote. And out of these, a radical bloc is formed, whose trade is to fight against the formative forces of culture, and puts the masses in tutelage by means of the franchise, freedom of the press, and terrorism. Thus is born nihilism, the abysmal hatred of the proletarian, of higher form of every sort, of culture as its essence, of society as its upholder and historical product. That any one should have form, master it, feel comfortable with it, whereas the common person feels fettered by it and unable to move freely under it. That tact, taste, a sense for tradition, should be things that belong to highly cultivated beings by inheritance. That there are circles in which a sense of duty and renunciation are not absurd, but lend distinction. All this fills the nihilist with a dull fury, which in earlier times crept away into the corners and there foamed at the mouth in the manner of the Thyristes, but is now widely diffused into the white nations as an actual world outlook. For the age has itself become vulgar, and most people have no idea to what extent they themselves are tainted. The bad manners of all parliaments, the general tendency to connive at a rather shady business transaction if it promises to bring in money without work, jazz and Negro dances as the spiritual outlet in all circles of society, women painted like prostitutes, the efforts of writers to win popularity by ridiculing in their novels and plays the correctness of well-bred people, and the bad taste shown even by the nobility and old princely families in throwing off every kind of social restraint and time-honored custom. All of these go to prove that it is now the vulgar mob that gives the tone. But while one half of the world smiles at well-bred forms and ancient customs, because it no longer regards them as inherently imperative, and does not suspect that it is a question of to be or not to be, the other half is unchaining the hatred that burns to destroy, the envy of everything that is not available to all, that is prominent and must be pulled down. Not only tradition and custom, but every kind of refinement. Beauty, grace, taste in dress, easy good manners, elegance of speech, control of one's limbs, education and self-discipline. Irritate the vulgar soul, till its blood boils. A finely formed face, the light and dainty step of a slim foot on the pavement, are contradictions of democracy. The preference of otium cum dignitate to boxing matches and 6-day races, the appreciation of fine art and poetry, even the delight in a well-kept garden of flowers and rare fruits, are things to be burnt, smashed, or stamped out. Culture, because of its superiority, is the enemy. Its creations cannot be understood or inwardly assimilated. Because they are not available for all, they must be annihilated. Such is the trend of nihilism. It occurs to no one to educate the masses to the level of true culture. That would be too much trouble, and possibly certain postulates for it are absent. On the contrary, the structure of society is to be leveled down to the standard of the populace. General equality is to reign. Everything is to be equally vulgar. The same way of getting money and the same pleasures to spend it on. Panem et circenses. No more is wanted, no more would be understood. Superiority, manners, taste, and every description of inward rank are crimes. Ethical, religious, national ideas, marriage for the sake of children, the family, state authority. All these are old-fashioned and reactionary. The picture of the streets of Moscow shows the goal, but let no one suppose that it is a spirit from Moscow that has conquered here. Bolshevism's home is Western Europe, and has been so ever since the English materialist worldview, which dominated the circles where Voltaire and Rousseau moved as docile puppets, found effective expression in Jacobinism on the continent. The democracy of the 19th century already amounted to Bolshevism. It lacked only the courage of its logical conclusions. It is only a step from the Bastille and the equality demanding guillotine to the ideals and street fighting of 1848, the year of the Communist Manifesto, and only a second step from there to the fall of Western Tsarism. Bolshevism does not menace us, it governs us. Its idea of equality is to equate the people and the mob. Its liberty consists in breaking loose from the culture and its society. Subsection 12. There is one other thing that belongs of necessity to a ripe culture. That is, property, the thought of which causes delirious outbursts of envy and hatred from the vulgar-minded. Property, that is, in the original sense. Old and permanent possession, inherited from forefathers, or acquired over long years by the heavy and devoted work of the owner, and cherished and increased for his sons and grandsons. Wealth is not the mere background of superiority, but, above all, the result and expression of it. A function not only of the way in which it has been acquired, but also of the ability needed to shape and use it as a true cultural element. Let it for once be said outright, though it is a slap in the face for the vulgarity of the age. Property is not a vice, but a gift, and a gift such as few possess. For it too is the product of long training through generations of distinction. Occasionally it is acquired in families that have worked their way upwards, by self-education on a groundwork of sound and strong race character, but practically never by original talent alone, without some precondition of educated environment and past example. It is not a question of how much one has, but of what one has, and the way in which one has it. Mere quantity as an end in itself is vulgar. One can have, and will to have, property as a means to power. This is a subordinating of economic successes to political aims, and it affirms the ancient experience that money belongs with leadership in war and state. This was Caesar's conception when he conquered and plundered Gaul, and that of Cecil Rhodes when he got the mines of South Africa into his hands, in order there to found an empire after his own heart. No poor nation can have great political successes, and so long as it regards poverty as virtue and riches as sin, it does not deserve any. This was the fundamental, though only half-conscious, meaning of the old Germanic expeditions by sea and land, for with the booty acquired, ships were built and followers enlisted. This type of the will to power is hallmarked by a royal generosity. It is the opposite of greed and miserliness, and equally remote from the nouveau riche prodigality and womanish love of one's neighbor. But this is besides the point. I am speaking of property owning insofar as it implies the tradition of a culture. It signifies inward superiority. It marks a distinction from whole classes of people. Not much is needed. A small, well-preserved homestead, a worthy craft reputably practiced, a tiny garden bearing evidence of cultivation by loving hands, a miner's spotless home, a few books or reproductions of classical art. The point is that these objects should be transformed into a personal world, should bear the stamp of the owner's personality. True possessions are soul, and only through that soul, culture. To estimate them by their money value is, however you look at it, either an incomprehension or a desecration. To divide them after the owner's death is a sort of murder. That was the Germanic conception of inheritance. Morally, an indissoluble unit, permeated by the soul of the dead owner who had administered it, and not a divisible sum. But who realizes this? Who today has eyes and feeling for the inward, almost metaphysical difference between property and money? True estates are those with which one is inwardly bound up, as is a Germanic warrior with the arms which he takes with him to the grave as his property, a farmer with the farm on which his forefathers worked, a merchant of the old type with his firm which bears the family name, a true craftsman with his workshop and his calling. Something, in a word, whose value cannot be expressed in words, but only in a close tie, the breaking of which means death. That is why real property, in the deeper sense, is always immovable. It clings to the owner. It consists of things, and is not merely invested in them like fortune, which can only be defined quantitatively, and actually has no home. Families who are making their way upward, therefore, seek a family seat as the original form of real estate, and those who are descending in the scale try to turn it into cash. And herein lies one of the differences between culture and civilization. But, quote, money, unquote, is an abstraction, a pure sense of values in the market language, which can only be measured mathematically by some currency or other. Its sole charm lies in the fact that one can come into it overnight, whether by gambling and burglary, or by political deals and speculation with sums that one does not possess, or again can throw it away from one moment to the next. On this point, proletarians and nouveau riche are in agreement, and here too there is an interrelationship between Bolshevism and Americanism. The money that a radical politician or a speculator manages to get, he insists on displaying. The palaces of the newly enriched Jacobins, the smart financiers who began with the French tax farmers of the 18th century, and the American millionaires tell their own tale. And just so was it in ancient Rome, where the display of all too quickly amassed wealth evoked the satire of Martial, Juvenal, and Petronius. Everything, of course, is really spent by such owners upon themselves. Even when they found something, quote, give, unquote, lavishly, or provide someone else with a subsidy, the spectator is to them the essential. Let the whole world know, or what good is it? They enjoy the spending as spending. They like to play the Maecenas, because they have heard of its being done. But they get no further than being what is in Munich called a Wirtsen, a snobbish patron, a copy of the Roman Trimalchio. They fill their house with things they are unable to appreciate. It is only the price that matters. The art dealers, one and all, batten on them now as in Caesar's time. But the most unmeaning wasters and debauchees are nevertheless to be found in obscure taverns, where unclean gains and party salaries are drunk and gambled away, and not in the townhouses of old patricians and the country estates of old families. But because culture, the tradition of enjoyment which knows how to make much of little, is lacking, and cannot be had for money, jealousy of this kind of superiority torments all vulgar-minded people. This must be said again and again, and particularly in these days when, quote, national, unquote, revolutionaries in Germany rave like mendicant friars about universal poverty and squalor, in delightful agreement with the Marxists, who declare the possession of any sort of wealth to be criminal and immoral, and war upon everything that has the superiority in things of high culture, and any who surpass others in the ability to acquire, maintain, and worthily use property, and that from envy of such ability, which they themselves completely lack. High culture is inseparably bound up with luxury and wealth. Luxury, that matter-of-course environment of things of culture that belongs spiritually to one's personality, is a premise of all creative periods. The birth of a great art, for instance, is not possible at the present time because the true artistic life died out within the last century. Then it had its home in society, where connoisseurs and the creators of important works could meet, and not among art dealers, art critics, and snobs, the, quote, people, unquote, or the, quote, public, unquote. And wealth, collected in the hands of a few and among the ruling classes, is amongst other things the foundation for the training of generations of leading minds through the example of a highly developed environment, without which there is no healthy economic life and no development of political talent. An inventor himself can be poor, but in a beggarly people there are no great tasks to bring his gifts to maturity. Often, indeed, he is not even conscious of possessing them. It is the same with the ability of statesmen and artists. That is why Germans have since 1648 been a world-remote people of theoreticians, poets, and musicians, for these alone can thrive on no money. They confused, and still today confuse, romantic visions with actual policy, for one need not pay a price for visions, except success. But wealth is a relative conception. To be, quote, not too well off, unquote, in England in 1770 corresponded to being very rich in Prussia. And poverty likewise. The Prussian nobility at its prime was poor, and therefore, in comparison with England, poor in statesmanlike qualities. For these are bred, with few exceptions, in the life of the great world. But although poor, it did not feel itself as living in poverty. The absence of any considerable property or income is no misfortune or misery, so little does its presence signify happiness in the ordinary sense. Not the fact itself, but a certain brooding over it, the sense of differences as contrasts, and jealousy turn it into a misfortune. To feel miserable, one must first be brought to loathe one's humble lot, and this has from all time been the demagogue's interest. in the Nuremberg of Dürer, say, "The plain man enjoyed without envy the splendor of the upper classes." Something of the glitter of his own city was reflected in him. He considered that his life course depended upon it, and was sure that he could never feel happy anywhere else. It is precisely the laborers and the craftsmen, with their uneducated reasoning, who are conscious that property means above all responsibility, care, and work. But from the 18th century, when the rationalist view of life, history, and human destiny begins to prevail, envy, which is quite foreign to the nature of good and industrious workers, was systematically cultivated by the underworld of democratic politicians and by writers of the moment, such as Rousseau, who by this means earned money or satisfied their morbid feelings. The desire for other people's property, which is called stolen goods, regardless of the work and ability put into it, was developed into a world outlook and produced appropriate politics from below. It was only then that the social revolution began to have the economic tendency which found expression in agitators' theories. And this tendency was concerned not with the organization and aims of the economic system, but with the monetary value of its investments and products. Contrasts between rich and poor were created in order to start the struggle between them. The idea was that everything available for turning into money should be shared out or held in common. If possession of it could not be obtained, it was to be destroyed, so that others should not continue to possess it. From this way of feeling and thinking, not of the lower orders of society, but of their self-nominated spokesmen, everything arose that in the classical age was called the equal distribution of goods, and today is called class war and socialism. It is the struggle from the above and below of society, and it is fought between leaders of nations and leaders from the underworld to whom the working classes are but objects and means for their own aims. Aging society puts up only a feeble defense. Its born enemies, however, continue to attack ruthlessly, until the rising Caesarism of the proletarian dictatorship makes an end of the Gracchan and Catilinarian tendencies. Subsection 13. We have thus obtained the premises on which to set out the full extent, aims, duration, and logical outcome of the quote, "white" unquote, revolution. No one has, as yet, ventured to do this, and indeed, the attempt may have been impossible until the consequences of the First World War had brought us to the threshold of the decisive decades. Skepticism, skepsis, the first requirement for the historic outlook, for history seeing through itself, just as contempt for humanity is the essential requirement for profound knowledge of it, does not stand at the beginning of things. This revolution does not commence with the materialistic socialism of the 19th century, still less with the Bolshevism of 1917. It has been in permanence, to borrow one of its current phrases, since the middle of the 18th century. It was then that rational criticism, proudly named the philosophy of the Enlightenment, began to turn its attention from the theological systems of Christianity and the traditional world philosophy of the scholars, which was nothing more than the theology without the will to system, to the facts of actuality, the state, society, and finally, the involved forms of economics. It commenced by depriving the concepts of nation, right, government, of their historical content, and interpreting the differences of rich and poor quite materialistically as a moral contrast, which was insisted upon by the agitators rather than honestly believed. At this point, political economy came in, a materialistic science, founded about 1770 by Adam Smith in association with Hartley, Priestley, Mandeville, and Bentham, that had the presumption to regard men as appurtenances of the economic situation, and to explain history in the light of prices, markets, and goods. To it, we owe the conception of work, not as the content of life and calling, but as the commodity in which the worker trades. The whole history of the formative passions and the creative characters of strong personalities and races is ignored. The will, focused on commanding and ruling, on power and booty, the inventive urge, hatred, revenge, pride and personal strength, and its successes, and equally, on the other side, jealousy, laziness, the poisonous emotions of the inferior. And there remain nothing but the laws of money and prices, which find expression in statistics and graphs. At the same time, there set in the flagellantism of the decaying, all-too-witty society, which could applaud the satires on its own absurdities. The admirers of the Marriage of Figaro, by Monsieur de Beaumarchais, performed in spite of the royal veto at the Chateau Genevièves to the simpering court nobility. Of the novels of Monsieur de Voltaire, devoured in the highest circles from London to Petersburg. Note, not only these literary bluffers from the petit bourgeois, sons of Caron the Rochemaker and Arouet the revenue officer, respectively, but even de Robespierre was still at the time of the National Assembly thus aping nobility. They wished to be counted as belonging to the society which they were destroying, a characteristic trait of all revolutionaries of this order. Of Hogarth's drawings, Gulliver's Travels, and Schiller's Robbers and Intrigue in Love, the only inspired works that exist in revolutionary literature, were anything but a lower-class public. As to what was written by the intellectuals of high society itself, the letters of Lord Chesterfield, the maxims of La Rochefoucauld, the Système de la Nature of Baron Holbach, it is all so very clever in style as to be unintelligible outside that circle. And it should be remembered that reading and writing were by no means universal among even the middle classes. Likewise, the socialist plays and novels of the 80s, and those written by the Bolshevists after 1918, which those against whom the attack was launched pay to see or read in every capital in Western Europe. All the better were the professional demagogues, who had learned nothing but speech-making and pamphlet writing, able to see the value of those works as a source for first-rate catchwords with which to stir up the masses. In England, disturbances began in 1762 with the case of Wilkes, who was condemned for insulting the government in the press, and thereupon elected again and again to the House of Commons. At meetings and in systematic riots, the war cry was, Wilkes and liberty, rioting for the cause of freedom of the press, universal suffrage, and even a republic. In that period, Marat had written, In England and for Englishmen, The Chains of Slavery, in 1774. The revolt of the American colonies in 1776, and their proclamation of the universal rights of man in the Republic. Their trees of liberty and associations were in reality the outcome of English movements during those years. The Loyalists, i.e., Americans not in favor of the Republic, emigrated at this time, more or less of their own free will, to Canada. From 1779 onwards, there arose the clubs and secret societies which spread over the whole country, aimed at revolution, and from 1790, headed by Fox and Sheridan, sent congratulatory addresses, letters, and advice to the Convention and to the Jacobins. Had not the reigning English plutocracy been far more vigorous than the cowardly court of Versailles, revolution would have broken out in London earlier than Paris. It did not come to this in Germany, because there was no real capital with its equipment of agitators, literary hacks, and professional criminals. The ideologies were there. We need only recall George Forster and others who in Mainz and later in Paris appeared as Jacobins and died for their opinions. In 1793, the political clubs on Anglo-French models had to be suppressed by an imperial law. The Paris clubs, particularly the Feuillants and the Jacobins, were nothing but copies of the English in their programs, their organization of branches all over France, and the form of their agitation. While the English, in turn, translated citoyen, the French form of address between members, into citizen, and the newly coined citizeness, and adopted, further, the phrase liberty, equality, fraternity, and the designation tyrants for kings. Since then, and even in our own time, this remains the form which preparation for the revolution takes. It was in those days that there arose the universal demand for freedom of the press, and of public meetings as a means thereto, the central demand of political liberalism, the desire to be free from the ethical restrictions of the old culture. Yet the demand was anything but universal. It was only called so by the ranters and writers who lived by it, and sought to further private aims through this freedom. But the older society itself, obsessed as it was by a spirit, the educated classes corresponding to the Philistines of the 19th century, that is, the very victims of this freedom, exalted it into an ideal which stood above any criticism of its background. Today, when both the hopes of the 18th and the results of the 20th century lie before us, we may be permitted to discuss it. Freedom from what? For what? Who financed the press and the agitation? Who gained by it? These liberties have shown themselves everywhere in their true light, as a means to be used by nihilism in leveling society, and by the underworld in inoculating the masses of the great cities with a particular opinion it has none of its own, which promises to be the best result for its aims. This is why these liberties, of which universal suffrage is one, are checked, suppressed, and completely inverted once they have done their work and given the power into the hands of their exploiters. It was so in Jacobin France in 1793, in Bolshevist Russia, and in Germany's Trade Union Republic of 1918. Where were there more suppressions of newspapers, in 1820 or in 1920? Liberty has always been the liberty of those who wish to obtain the power, not to abolish it. This active liberalism progresses from Jacobinism to Bolshevism, logically. These are not in opposition of thought and will, but are the early and the late form, the beginning and the end, of one single movement. It began about 1770, with sentimental, quote, social-political, unquote, tendencies. The structure of society, according to class and rank, was to be destroyed, and there was to be a return to nature, to the uniformity of the herd. The place of class was to be taken by that which has no class, money and intelligence, counting house and the lecturer's chair, arithmeticians and clerks, in place of form-ordered existence, life without form, manners, obligation, or respect. It was only about 1840 that this, quote, social-political, unquote, tendency passed into a, quote, economic-political, unquote, one. The scapegoats are now no longer the aristocrats, but the possessors, from peasant to entrepreneur. The disciples of the movement are promised not equal rights, but the privilege of the unpropertied, not freedom for all, but the dictatorship of the city proletariat, the, quote, workers, unquote. But this represents no change of a world outlook, which was, and still is, materialistic and utilitarianism, but solely a change in revolutionary methods. The professional demagogues now mobilize a different section of the nation for class war. At first, about 1770, peasants and craftsmen were approached with some hesitation. The kahir of small town and country deputies in 1789, which were supposed to represent the, quote, cry of the nation, unquote, were composed by professional ranters, and were not understood at all by the greater part of the electorate. These classes were too deeply rooted in tradition to be unconditionally available as means and weapons. Without the mob from the eastern suburbs, the vistas of the capital always handy, the reign of terror in Paris would have been impossible. It is not true that the problem was one of economic necessities. Rates and taxes were sovereign rights. Universal suffrage was intended as a blow against the structure of society. Hence the failure of the convention. Peasants and craftsmen were no reliable following for professional demagogues. They possessed a native sense of respect and self-respect. They had too much instinct and too little town intelligence. They were industrious and had learned something. Besides, they wished to leave the farm or the workshop to their sons. No permanent effect could be made upon them by programs and catchwords. Only about 1840 did the pamphlet and platform demagogy of Western Europe, whose development had proceeded on uniform lines, discovered a better medium for their ends, in the uprooted mass of men who had gathered round the North European coal area, the type of the industrial worker. It is time we were clear in our own minds about one fact which has been completely smothered in the midst of the party politicians' wars. It was not the, quote, economic distress, unquote, into which capitalism had brought the proletariat that had led to the rise of socialism, but the professional agitation which created this, quote, clear-eyed, unquote, outlook on things, just as it had drawn an utterly false picture of the distressed peasant class before 1789, purely because it hoped thereby to get a wholehearted following. And the uneducated and half-educated middle class believed in this picture, and does so to this day. The word, quote, worker, unquote, has been surrounded by a halo since 1848, without consideration of its meaning and the limits of its application. And the working class, which does not exist in the economic structure of a single nation, for what have miners, sailors, tailors' apprentices, metal workers, waiters, bank officials, plowmen, and scavengers in common with one another, becomes a political reality, an attacking party, which has split all, quote, white, unquote, nations into two armies, of which the one has to feed and to give its blood for a host of party agents, tub thumpers, newspaper writers, and, quote, people's representatives, unquote, who pursue their own private aims. That is the purpose for which it exists. The contrast between capitalism and socialism, words for which, all this time, literature has been searched in vain for a definition, for catchwords are not to be defined, is not derived from any reality, but is purely a built-up challenge. Marx introduced these terms into the English engineering industry. He did not draw them from it. And even so, he could only do it by ignoring the existence of all the people engaged in agriculture, commerce, traffic, and administration. This picture of the time had so little to do with the world of reality and its inhabitants that, in theory, the South became even separated from the North. The boundary lay somewhere around the line Lyon-Milan. In the Latin South, where one needs little to live on and does little work, where there is no coal and therefore no industrialism, where thought and feeling are racially different, there developed anarchist and syndicalist tendencies, whose wish picture was the dissolution of the great national organisms into systemless, small, self-sufficing groups, Bedouin-like swarms occupied in doing nothing. But in the North, where hard winters mean harder work, and make such work not only possible but essential, where from time immemorial the battle has been against hunger and cold combined, there arose out of the Germanic will to power, and its urge to large-scale organization, systems of authoritarian communism which aim at a proletarian dictatorship over the whole world. And, simply because in the 19th century the coal fields of those northern lands had attracted an assemblage of people and of national wealth of a hitherto unheard-of order of magnitude, a very different impetus was given to demagogy, both within them and outwards from their boundaries. The high wages of the English, German, and American factory workers triumphed, precisely because they were anything but, quote, starvation rates, unquote, over the low rates of the land workers in the South. And only because of this, quote, capitalistic, unquote, superiority of party means did Marxism triumph over the theories of Fourier and Proudhon. The peasantry had already ceased to exist for all of them. As a weapon in the class war, it had small value, not merely because it was not available on the pavements at any and every moment, but also because its traditions of property and labor were contrary to the views of theory. It was, therefore, ignored by the catchwords of the communist program. Bourgeoisie and proletariat, that is a picture one can take in. And the simpler one is, the less one notices how much there is left outside of this scheme. Every demagogy forms its program according to the section of the nation which it hopes to mobilize for its purpose. In Rome, from Flaminius to C. Gracchus, it was the Italian peasant farmers who wanted land, so that they might till it. Hence the division of the Gallic area south of the Po by the former, and the demand for the division of the Ager Publicus by the latter. But Gracchus went under because the peasants, who had moved into Rome in masses to vote, had to go home again for the harvest. After this experience, the demagogy of the types of Cinna and Catiline had to rely upon slaves, and above all, instead of on industrious journeymen, like demagogy in the Greek cities from the Cleon's time, upon the unskilled populace of mixed origins, which prowled about the streets of Rome, and asked to be fed and amused, panem et circenses. And precisely because, for the next century, these masses had to be won over by ever-increasing expenditure, they grew, even after Caesar, to a size which made them a standing danger to the government of the world empire. The lower the type of such a following, the more usable it is. For this reason has Bolshevism, ever since the Paris Commune of 1871, made far less effort to influence the skilled, industrious, and sober worker than the work-shy rabble of the cities, which is ready at any time to plunder and murder. For this reason also have the ruling trade unionist parties in Germany, from 1918 right into the peak years of unemployment, been careful to allow no legal differentiation between the workless and the work-shy. At that time, while assistance was being given to the supposed unemployed, there was a dearth of workers, especially on the land, and no one seriously tried to remedy it. The sickness relief funds were misused by thousands as a way of evading work. Unemployment in its early stages was positively fostered by Marxism. The concept, quote, proletarian, unquote, excludes all joy in work. A worker who knows his job and is proud of his achievement has no qualifications for proletarianism. He is a drag on the revolutionary movement. He has to be proletarianized, demoralized, before he is of use to it. That is the true Bolshevism by which this revolution will reach its climax, but by no means its close. It is characteristic of the superficial way in which the whole white world thinks that this Bolshevism is regarded as a Russian creation, threatening to conquer Europe. Actually, it was born in Western Europe, and born indeed of logical necessity as the last phase of the liberal democracy of 1770, and the last triumph of political rationalism, which is to say, of the presumptuous intention to control living history by paper systems and ideals. Its first outbreak on a large scale, after the June conflicts of 1848, was the Paris Commune of 1871, which came near to mastering the whole of France. Only the army prevented it. That and the German policy which gave the army its moral support. It was then, and not in Russia in 1917, that out of the facts of a besieged capital were born the workers' and soldiers' councils which Marx, a simpleton in practical matters, ever afterwards commended as the possible form for a communist government. It was then that the mass slaughters of opponents were carried out, which cost France more lives than the whole of her war against Germany. It was then that the work-shy rabble were in power, and not the working class. Deserters, criminals, and bullies, literary men and journalists, with among them, as always, many foreigners, Poles, Jews, Italians, and even Germans. But it was a specifically French form of revolution. There was no mention of Marx, but all the more of Proudhon, Fourier, and the Jacobins of 1792. A loose alliance of the large cities, that is, of their lower classes, was to overthrow and conquer the open country and provincial towns, a notion typical of Latin anarchy. Something similar had been attempted in 1411 by the butcher Caboche, with a militarily organized Parisian populace, and the same idea was copied faithfully in Petersburg in 1917, with just such another, quote, Western, unquote, populace, and with the same catchwords. The Asiatic side of this revolution in Russia, however, which hardly emerged at the time, and has still not succeeded in overcoming Western communistic forms of Soviet rule, found its earliest expression in Pugachev's insurrection from 1772 to 1775, which seized the whole of the Upper Volga region, and even for a time Moscow, putting Tsarism itself in peril. The fanatically religious peasantry, including whole Cossack tribes, killed everything in the way of representatives of Petrin, European-made Russia who fell into their hands. Officers, officials, and above all, the new nobility. They would have treated the representatives of the Soviet bureaucracy in the same way, and their descendants would gladly have it happen today. Perhaps they will really do it tomorrow. Hatred of this foreign type of government, against which the Moscow of these days is less and less able to defend itself, is very old. It goes back to the insurrection of the Strelets against Peter the Great. Democrats and socialists from the West cannot appreciate a feeling so alien to their own way of thinking. It marks the contrast between the real Bolshevism, which seethes underground amongst all white nations, and has produced these very Democrats and socialists, and that other form, the hatred which is piling up amongst all the colored populations of the world, against the whole white civilization, its revolutionary currents with the rest. And now, what is the attitude of, quote, society, unquote, in the West European civilizations in 1770, and particularly since 1848, towards the fact of this revolution from below? which has long since reached the stage of scorning and deriding its liberal beginnings, and the concessions they have won, such as freedom of the press, of unions, and of meeting, finally universal suffrage, after exploiting them to the furthest limits of disintegration. By society, we mean here that which is now generally called the, quote, middle classes, unquote, in England, and the, quote, bourgeoisie, unquote, on the continent, the peasants being, as usual, ignored. It is a chapter of shame that here presents itself to the historian of the future. Built up though it was on the basic human facts of rulership, grade, and property, society met the nihilist attack upon these with submission, understanding, acclamation, and support. This intellectual suicide was the common fashion of last century. It must be stated again and again that this society, in which our own time the transition from culture to civilization is taking place, is sick. Sick in its instincts, and therefore in its mind. It offers no defense. It takes pleasure in its own vilification and disintegration. From the middle of the 18th century, it is broken up more and more into liberal and conservative circles, the latter representing merely the opposition set up in desperate self-defense against the former. On the one side, there is a small number of people who, possessed of the true political instinct, see what is going on and whither it is leading and exert themselves to prevent, moderate, or divert accordingly. People of the kind who formed Scipio's circle in Rome, and whose outlook inspired Polybius' historical work. And again, Burke, Pitt, Wellington, and Disraeli in England, Metternich, Hegel, and Bismarck in Germany, and Tocqueville in France. They sought to defend the conserving forces of the old culture: state, monarchy, army, consciousness of standing, property, peasantry, even in cases where they had reason to object and are therefore cried down as, quote, reactionary, unquote. This word, which the liberals invented, is thrown back at them now by their Marxian pupils, in that they try to prevent the logical outcome of their actions. Such is our reputed progress. On the other side stands almost everything that has the urban intelligence, or, if not, at least looks up to it as the badge of superiority in the conditions of today, and in terms of the power of the future that is already the past. At this point, journalism becomes the dominant expression of the time. It is the critical spirit of the 18th century, diluted and lightened for intellectual mediocrity. Drama, poetry, philosophy, even science and history, are turned into leading articles and feuilletons, written with unashamed bias against everything that is conservative and has formerly inspired respect. Party becomes the liberal substitute for rank and state. Revolution, in the form of periodic mass elections, fought by all available means of money, brains, and even, after the Grachen method, physical violence, is exalted into a constitutional process. Government, as the meaning and duty of state existence, is either opposed and derided or degraded to the level of a party business. But the blindness and cowardice of liberalism goes further still. Tolerance is extended to the destructive forces of the city dregs, not demanded by them. In Western Europe, Russian nihilists and Spanish anarchists are gushed over in, quote, good, unquote, society, with revolting sentimentality, and they are passed on from one fashionable hostess to another. In Paris and London, above all in Switzerland, both they and their undermining activities are carefully protected. The liberal press rings with maledictions of the prisons in which the martyrs of liberty languish, and not a word is dropped in favor of the countless defenders of the state, down to the simple soldier and policeman, who are blown into the air, crippled by bullet wounds, or slaughtered in the exercise of their duty. Note: when Schopenhauer left to summon his will for the dependents of soldiers who fell in Berlin in 1848, no one else would have given such a thought to these victims of the revolution. Literary men cried out at so scandalous an action. It was the same spirit which inspired the sympathy expressed with the Bolshevist mass murderer Trotsky, when the bourgeois governments of Western Europe refused state protection to enable him to visit a watering place. The concept of the proletariat, created of deliberate intention by socialist theoreticians, has been accepted by the middle classes. Actually, it has nothing to do with the thousands of branches of strict and skilled labor, from fishing to book printing, from tree felling to engine driving, and is scorned and felt as a disgrace by industrious, trained workers. It was intended solely to secure the amalgamation of these workers with the city mob for the purpose of overthrowing the social order. But liberalism centered political thought upon it by employing it as though it was an established concept. Under the name naturalism, there arose a pitiable school of literature and painting which exalted filth to aesthetic charm, and vulgar feeling and thinking to a binding worldview. Quote, people, unquote, no longer meant the community of the whole nation, but that section of the city masses which set up in opposition to this community. The proletarian appeared as the hero on the stage of the progressive bourgeoisie, and with him the prostitute, the shirker, the agitator, the criminal. From this time onwards, it has been modern and superior to see the world from below, from the perspective of a bar parlor or the street of ill repute. The cult of the proletarian arose during that period, and in the liberal circles of Western Europe, not in 1918 in Russia. A fatal notion of things, half false and half stupid, began to pervade educated and semi-educated minds. The worker becomes the real person, the real nation, the meaning and aim of history, politics, public care. The fact that all men work, and moreover that others, the inventor, the engineer, the organizer, do more, and more important, work, is forgotten. No one any longer dares to bring forward the class or quality of his achievement as a gauge of its value. Only work measured in hours now counts as labor. And the worker, with all this, is the poor unfortunate one, disinherited, starving, exploited. The words care and distress are applied to him alone. No one has a thought left for the countryman's less fertile strips of land, his bad harvests, his losses by hail and frost, his anxiety over the sale of his produce, or for the wretched existence of the poor craftsman in strongly industrialized areas. The tragedies of small tradesmen, fishermen on the high seas, inventors, doctors, who have to struggle amidst alarms and dangers for each bite of daily bread, and go down in their thousands unheeded. Quote, the worker, unquote, alone receives sympathy. He alone is supported, cared for, insured. What is more, he is made the saint, the idol of the age. The world revolves around him. He is the sole focus of the economic system and the nursling of politics. Everybody's existence hinges on him. The majority of the nation are there to serve him. The dull lump of a peasant, the lazy official, the swindling tradesman, are all legitimate targets for mirth, not to mention judges, officers, and heads of business, who are the popular objects of ill-natured jest. But no one would dare to form the same scorn on, quote, the working man, unquote. All the rest are idlers, egoists. He is the one exception. The whole middle class swings the censer before this phantom. No matter what one's own achievements in life may be, one must fall on one's knees before him. His being stands above all criticism. It was the middle classes who successfully put over this notion of him, and the very business-like representatives of the people continued to sponge upon the legend. They dinned it into the wage earners until they believed it, until they felt themselves to be really ill-treated and wretched, until they lost all senses of proportion with regard to their output and their importance. Liberalism vis-a-vis the demagogic trend is the form of suicide adopted by our sick society. With this perspective, it gives itself up. The merciless, embittered class war that is waged against it finds it prepared to capitulate politically, after having helped spiritually in the forging of the enemy weapons. Only the conservative element, weak as it was in the 19th century, can, and in the future will, hinder the coming of this end. Subsection 14. Who is it, then, who has flattered and organized this mass of wage earners in the cities and industrial areas, provided them with catchwords, driven them by cynical propaganda into the class war against the majority of the nation? It is not the industrious and the highly trained workman, the vagabond as he is contemptuously called in the Marx-Engels correspondence. In a letter to Marx on the 9th May 1851, Engels speaks of the democratic red and communistic mob, and on the 11th of December 1851 writes to him, quote, "What is the rabble good for if it forgets how to fight?" End quote. The manual worker is merely a means to the private ends of professional revolutionaries. He is to fight for the satisfaction of their hatred of the conservative forces and their thirst for power. If only workers were to be recognized as representatives of the workers, the benches of the left would be very empty in all parliaments. Among the originators of their theoretical programs and leaders of revolutionary campaigns, there is not one who actually worked for years in a factory. What mostly happened, in fact, was that the worker who, quote, worked his way up, unquote, by industry and ability, rose to the management of a business. The political bohemia of Western Europe, in which Bolshevism grew up from the middle of the 19th century, was composed of the same elements which went to the masking of revolutionary liberalism of 1770. Whether the February Revolution of 1848 in Paris was for, quote, capitalism, unquote, or that of June against it, whether liberty and equality were to be secured for the middle class in 1789, or for the lower orders in 1793 and 1918, the aims of the inciters of these movements, and their ultimate motives, were, in fact, all exactly the same. And no different is the situation in Spain today, and perhaps that in the United States tomorrow. It is from the intellectual mob, with the failures from all academic professions, the spiritually unfit and morally inhibited, at its head, that the gangsters of liberal and Bolshevist risings are recruited. Their, quote, dictatorship of the proletariat, unquote, which is to say, their own dictatorship with the help of the proletariat, is to be their revenge on those who are happy and successful, as a last means of appeasing the morbid vanity and vulgar greed for power, which alike arise from unsettled self-respect, the final expression of depraved and misdirected instincts. Among all these jurists, journalists, schoolmasters, artists, and technicians, one is apt to overlook one type, the most sinister of all, the sunken priest. Religion is the personal relation to the powers of the world around us, expressed in a worldview, in pious usages and the personal attitudes of renunciation. A church is the organization of a priesthood which fights for its temporal power. It brings the forms of religious life, and therewith the people who cling to them, under its power, and it is therefore the born enemy of all other forms of power, state, rank, or nation. During the Persian Wars, the priesthood of Delphi agitated on behalf of Xerxes, and against the national defense. Cyrus was able to conquer Babylon and overthrow Nabonid, the last king of the Chaldees, because the priesthood of Marduk was in league with him. The histories of ancient Egypt and ancient China are full of examples of the sort, and in the West there was only occasionally truce between monarchy and church, throne and altar, nobility and priesthood, when an alliance between them against a third party promised to be advantageous. Quote, "My kingdom is not of this world," unquote, is the deep saying which is true of every religion, and is betrayed by every church. But every church, from the very fact of its existence, falls in with the conditions of historical life. It thinks in terms of political power and material economy. It wages war in diplomatic and military fashion, and shares with other institutions of power the consequences of youth and age, rise and decay. Above all, in respect of conservative policy and tradition in state and society, it is not honest and qua church cannot be so. All young sects are at the bottom hostile to state and property, class and rank, and are attracted by universal equality. And every revolutionary movement, on the contrary, has quite unintentional and often unobserved tendency to take on the forms of a cult. The cult of reason in the French Revolution is one example, Lenin's mausoleum another. And the policy of any church that has grown old, conservative as it may be with regard to itself, is always being tempted to become in relation to the state and society liberal, democratic, or socialistic. That is, leveling and destructive, as soon as the struggle between tradition and the mob sets in. All priests are human beings, and hence the fate of churches becomes dependent upon the human material of their continuously changing personnel. Even the strictest selection, and it is as a rule masterly, cannot prevent vulgar instincts and vulgar thought from becoming frequent and even predominant in times of social degeneration and revolutionary demolition. In all such times, there is a priest rabble, which drags the dignity and faith of the church through the mud of party politics, allies itself with the revolutionary forces, and, by sentimental talk about loving one's neighbor and helping the poor, eggs on the underworld to set about destroying the social order, that order with which the church is irrevocably and fatally bound up. A religion is that which the soul of the faithful is. A church is worth just as much as the priest material of which it is composed is worth. At the beginning of the French Revolution, we have, besides the swarm of degenerate abbés, who for years had mocked at authority and rank in their writing and preaching, the runaway monk Fouché and the renegade bishop Talleyrand, both of them regicides and thieves en grande, Napoleonic dukes and traitors to their country. From 1815 onward, the Protestant priest tends to become more and more a Democrat, socialist, and party politician. Lutheranism, which is hardly a church, and Puritanism, which is not one at all, have neither of them as such promoted any destructive policy. The individual priest went on his own account amongst the people and into the workers' party, spoke in electoral assemblies and parliaments, wrote on social questions, and ended as a demagogue and Marxian. The Catholic priest, however, who was more firmly attached to his church, pulled it over with him. It became woven into the party agitations, at first as an effective medium, and finally as a sacrifice to this policy. A Catholic trade union movement with socialist syndicalist tendencies existed in France as early as Napoleon III's reign. In Germany, the first example of such arose after 1870, inspired by the fear that the red trade unions would gain sole power over the masses in the industrial areas. And it at once came to an understanding with these. All workers' parties are dimly aware of their common cause, however much the executive groups may hate each other. Truly, it is a long time since Leo XIII's view of world politics commanded a following, and a true prince of the church, like Cardinal Kopp, ruled over the clergy in Germany. At that period, the church was conscious of being a conservative force, and it knew well that its fate was bound up with that of the other conservative forces: state authority, monarchy, the social order, and property. That it stood, in the class war, unconditionally against the liberal and socialist forces, on the right, and that its prospect of outlasting the revolutionary age depended upon doing so. But the change has come quickly. Spiritual discipline is shaken. The activities of the mob element in the priesthood tyrannize over the church, right up to the highest positions, and those who hold them are forced to keep silence to hide their impotence from the world. Church diplomacy, formerly directed from above in so distinguished a manner, and exercising its tactical judgments over things decades ahead, gives way increasingly to the vulgar methods of day-to-day politics, to party democratic agitation from below, with its contemptible dodges and specious argumentation. Thought and action are more on the level of the cosmopolitan underworld. The traditional striving for temporal power is reduced to petty ambition in the direction of election successes and alliances with other mob parties for the sake of material results. The mob element in the priesthood, once severely curbed, now prevails, with its proletarian way of thinking, over the really worthy section of the clergy that considers the soul of a man to be worth more than his vote, and takes metaphysical problems more seriously than demagogic raids upon economic life. Tactical mistakes, such as the Spaniards made in imagining they could separate the destinies of throne and altar, would not have been made a few decades back. But since the end of the World War, the Church, in Germany above all, where, being an ancient power of rigid traditions, it had to pay heavily in prestige with its own adherents by descending to street level, has sunk to class wars and association with Marxism. There is in Germany a Catholic Bolshevism which is more dangerous than the anti-Christian, because it hides behind the mask of a religion. Now, all communist systems in the West are, in fact, derived from Christian theological thought. More's Utopia, the Sun State of the Dominica Campanella, the doctrines of Luther's disciples Karlstadt and Thomas Munzer, and Fichte's state socialism. What Fourier, Saint-Simon, Owen, Marx, and hundreds of others dreamed and wrote on the ideals of the future reaches back, quite without their knowledge and much against their intention, to priestly moral indignation and schoolmen concepts, which had their secret part in economic reasoning and in public opinion on social questions. How much of Thomas Aquinas' law of nature and conception of state is still to be found in Adam Smith, and therefore, with the opposite sign, in the Communist Manifesto? Christian theology is the grandmother of Bolshevism. All abstract brooding over economic concepts that are remote from any economic experience must, if courageously and honestly followed out, lead in one way or another to reasoned conclusions against state and property. And only lack of vision saves these materialist schoolmen from seeing that at the end of their chain of thought stands the beginning once more. Effective communism is authoritative bureaucracy. To put through the ideal requires dictatorship, reign of terror, armed force, the inequality of a system of masters and slaves, men in command and men in obedience. In short, Moscow. But there are two sorts of communist. The one, the credulous type, obsessed by doctrine or feminine sentimentality, remote from and hostile to the world, condemns the wealth of the wicked who prosper, and also, at times, the poverty of the good who do not prosper. This lands him in either vague utopias or throws him back upon asceticism, the monastic life, bohemia, or vagabondism, which proclaim the futility of all economic effort. But the other, the worldly type with the realist political outlook, hopes through its followers to destroy society, either from envy or revenge, because of the low place assigned in it to their personality and talents. Or, alternatively, to carry away the masses by some program or other, for the satisfaction of his own will to power. But this, too, likes to hide itself under the cloak of some religion. Marxism is indeed a religion, not in the sense of its founder, but in that which his revolutionary following has imparted to it. Like any church, it has its saints, apostles, martyrs, fathers, Bible, and mission. Like any church, it has dogmas, heresy tribunals, an orthodoxy and scholasticism, and above all, a popular moral, or rather two, for believers and unbelievers. And does it make any difference that its doctrine is materialistic through and through? Are those priests who agitate on economic questions any less so? What are, actually, Christian trade unions, Christian Bolshevism? Neither more nor less. Since the beginning of the rationalist age, that is, since 1750, there is materialism both with and without Christian terminology. As soon as one mixes up the concepts of poverty, hunger, distress, work, and wages, with the moral undertone of rich and poor, right and wrong, and is led thereby to join in the social and economic demands of the proletarian sort, that is, money demands, one is a materialist. And then, the pressing inward need for a high altar is supplied by the party secretariat, for a poor box by election funds, and the trade union official becomes the successor to St. Francis. This materialism of the late megalopolis is a practical cast of thought and action, whatever the faith may be that accompanies it. It is the mode of regarding history and public and personal life economically, and of looking upon economics not as a thing of vocations and the content of lives, but as the method by which the least exertion and the most money and pleasure can be secured. Panem et circenses. Most people nowadays do not realize at all how materialistic they are in themselves and their thought. They may be zealous in prayer and confession, and have the word God forever on their lips. They may even be priests in calling and conviction, and yet be materialists. Christian morality is, like every morality, renunciation and nothing else. Those who do not feel it to be so are materialists. Quote, "In the sweat of thy face shalt thou eat bread," unquote, means, do not regard this hard meaning of life as misery, and seek to circumvent it by party politics. But for proletarian election propaganda, the precept is certainly not suitable. The materialist prefers to eat the bread that others have earned in the sweat of their face, the peasant, the craftsman, the inventor, the captain of industry. But the famous eye of a needle, through which many a camel passes, is not too narrow for the rich man only. It is equally narrow for the man who extorts bigger wages and shorter working hours by means of strikes, sabotage, and elections. And for him, too, who engineers these for the sake of his own power. It is the utility moral of the slave souls, not because of their situation in life, for that we are all without exception, from the destiny of being born in a particular place and time, but because to regard the world from below is mean. Does one regard the state of being rich with envy or with contempt? Does one acknowledge the man who has by personal superiority worked his way up to the rank of a leader, from locksmith's apprentice, say, to the founder and owner of a factory? Or does one hate him and try and pull him down? That is the test. But this materialism, to which renunciation is incomprehensible and absurd, is nothing but egoism of individuals and classes, the parasitic egoism of inferior minds, who regard the economic life of other people, and that of the whole, as an object from which to squeeze with the least possible exertion the greatest possible enjoyment. Panem et circenses. Such people look upon personal distinction, industry, success, joy and achievement, as wickedness, sin, and treason. It is the moral of class war, which lumps all this together under the name capitalism, which had from the first a moral significance, and sets it up as a target for proletarian hate, while on the other side it aims at welding the wage earners into one political front with the underworld of the great cities. Only the, quote, worker, unquote, is permitted and commanded to be the egoist, not the peasant or craftsman. He alone has rights instead of obligations. The others have obligations and no rights. He is the privileged class whom the others have to serve by their labor. The economic life of the nation exists for him and must be organized solely with a view to his comfort, whether it falls to pieces in the process or not. That is the world outlook, fashioned by the people's representatives class, and by academic riffraff from professor to priest, by which the lower orders of society are demoralized, in order that they may be mobilized in the interests of the leader's hatred and thirst for power. For this reason, socialists of higher quality and conservative ways of thinking, like Lassalle, supporter of monarchy, and Georges Sorel, who looked upon the defense of fatherland, family, and property as the noblest task of the proletariat, and of whom Mussolini has said that he owes more to him than Nietzsche, are difficult to reconcile with Marx, and are therefore never quoted according to their true intent. Among the many sorts of theoretical socialism or communism, it is, of course, the lowest, and in its ultimate intentions the most dishonest, that has won the day. The one which has been most ruthlessly directed towards acquiring power over the masses for the professional revolutionaries. We may call it Marxism or not as we please. It is equally unimportant which theory supplies the catchwords for propaganda, or behind which non-revolutionary world outlook it conceals itself. The practical thought and intention is all that matters. He who is vulgar thinks, feels, and acts vulgarly, and will not be changed by donning priestly robes or wearing national flags. Whoever founds or leads trade unions or labor parties anywhere in the world today is almost of necessity bound to succumb very quickly to the Marxist ideology, which slanders and persecutes all political and economic leadership, the social order, authority, and property, under the collective concept of capitalism. He will at once find among his followers the now traditional conception of the economic system as class war, and will be forced to depend upon it if he wishes to remain a leader. Once for all, proletarian egoism, with its aims and methods, is the form in which the white revolution has been working itself out for almost a century, and it makes little difference whether it calls itself a social or socialist movement, and whether its leaders insist on being Christians or not. The flowering of world improvement theories fills the first ascending century of rationalism, from the social contract in 1762 to the Communist Manifesto of 1848. In those days, men believed, like Socrates and the sophists, in omniscience of human reason, and its ability to control destinies and instincts, and to order and direct historical life. Even in the Linnaean system, the the human being took rank as the Homo sapiens. The beast in man, which gave a forceful reminder of its existence in 1792, was forgotten. Never were people further removed from the skepticism of the true judge of history, and the wise man who knows in all ages that man is wicked from his youth up. It was thought that the nations could be organized according to the doctrinaire programs, with a view to their ultimate bliss. And at any rate, the readers of these materialistic utopias believed in them, though how far the writers did is another matter. But after 1848, all this came to an end. One of the reasons why the Marxian system became the most effective was that it was the last. Anyone who today draws up political or economic programs for the salvation of mankind is out of date and tiresome. He is near to becoming ridiculous. But the upsetting effect of such theories on blockheads, who in Lenin's estimation amount to 95% of all humanity, is still very great, and is actually on the increase in England and America. Except in Moscow, where there is only a pretense for political purposes of believing in it. The classical political economy of 1770, and the equally old materialistic, or, quote, economic, unquote, conception of history, both of which deduce the destinies of millennia from the concepts of market, price, goods, belong fundamentally to the same category. They are inwardly related, in many ways identical, and lead inevitably to dreams of a third empire such as the 19th century faith in progress looked as some way for the end of history. It was the materialistic travesty of the conceptions of a third kingdom, held by great Gothic Christians like Joachim de Flores. It was to establish perfect bliss on earth, the fool's paradise of all the poor and wretched, who more and more came to be identified with the worker. It was to bring with it the end of anxiety, the dolce far niente, and eternal peace. And the road to it was to be made by class war and the abolition of property, the breaking down of interest slavery, state socialism, and the destruction of all masters and plutocrats. It was triumphant class egoism, labeled welfare of mankind, and raised morally to heaven. The ideal of the class war appears first in 1789, in the famous propaganda pamphlet of Abbé Sieyès, again a Catholic priest, on the Third Estate, which was to level the two above it. From this young revolutionary liberal form, it developed logically into the Bolshevist late form of 1848, which transferred the struggle from the political to the economic domain, not for the sake of economic life, but for the purpose of securing political aims by its destruction. If middle-class ideologists discover any difference between idealism and materialism in this connection, they must be unable to see through the foreground of catchwords into the depths of the ultimate aims, which, in the one and the other case, are absolutely the same. All class war theories have been drawn up with the object of mobilizing the masses of the large cities. The, quote, class, unquote, which could be used for fighting, had first to be created. The aim was described in 1848, when the first experience of revolutions lay well behind, as the dictatorship of the proletariat. But that first experience might equally have been called the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie, for that is all that liberalism sets out to be. It is the ultimate meaning of the constitutions, republics, and parliamentarism. But in reality, what was meant in each case was the dictatorship of the demagogues, and the demagogue's intention was in part, by aid of a systematically demoralized mob, to annihilate nations out of pure revenge, and in part to gratify their thirst for power by enslaving them. Every ideal is born of someone who has need of it. The ideal of the liberal, as of the Bolshevist, class war, was created by people who had either striven unsuccessfully to gain admittance to the higher class of society than their own, or found themselves in one whose ethical standard they could not rise. Marx is a, quote, failed bourgeois, unquote, hence his hatred of the bourgeoisie. And the same applies to all the other lawyers, writers, professors, and priests. They had chosen a profession to which they were not called. This is the moral premise of professional revolution. The ideal of class war is, as we all know, an overthrow. Not the construction of anything new, but the destruction of what exists. It is an aim without a future. It is the will to nothing. Utopian programs are designed only for the spiritual bribery of the masses. The only serious intention is in the object of the bribery, the creation of class as a fighting force by means of systematic demoralization. Nothing is a better welder than hate. We ought, though, to speak of class envy rather than class hatred. For in hatred, there is a silent acknowledgement of the opponent, while envy is the crooked glance from below up to something higher, which remains uncomprehended and unattainable, and must, therefore, be pulled off its perch, sullied and despised. The vision of the proletarian future, therefore, embraces not only the happiness of the many, which consists in happily doing nothing, once more panem et circenses, and perpetual peace in which to enjoy it, free from all anxiety and responsibility, but also, and primarily, with typical revolutionary bad taste, the opportunity of gloating over the unhappiness of the few, of the once mighty, the wise, the aristocratic, and the rich. Every revolution proves it. It is only half the fun for the lackeys of yesterday to gorge at their master's table. Their masters must also wait upon them. The target of class war, which about 1789 had been waged against tyrants, kings, squires, and parsons, began about 1850, for by that time the political struggle had been transferred to the economic sphere, to be, quote, capitalism, unquote. It is hopeless to try to define this catchword, for such it is. It is no product of economic experience, but is meant to have a moral, not to say semi-Christian, implication. It is intended to express the essence of economic evil, the great sin of superiority, the devil disguised as economic success. In certain middle-class circles, it has even become a term of abuse for everyone who is disliked, every person of rank, successful entrepreneurs and tradesmen, as well as judges, officers, and scientists, or even peasants. It denotes everyone who is not a worker or labor leader, everyone who has not failed through inferior ability. For all malcontents, for the spiritual mob, it serves as one comprehensive label for those who are strong and sound. Quote, capitalism, unquote, is in no sense a form of economy, or a, quote, bourgeois, unquote, method of making money. It is a way of looking at things. There are economists who have discovered in the time of Charlemagne and in the most primitive villages. Since 1770, economists have regarded the economic system, which is really one side of a nation's historical existence, from the standpoint of the English merchant. The English nation was at that time engaged in monopolizing world commerce, hence its reputation as a nation of shopkeepers. But the merchant is only a middleman. The existence of economic life is a premise of his own activity in making himself the center of gravity around which others, in the role of producers and consumers, revolve. This position of power is what Adam Smith describes, his science. And that is why economics to this day starts from the viewpoint of prices, and envisages goods and markets instead of economic life and active human beings. And this is why, henceforth, and especially since the rise of socialist theory, labor also counts as goods, and wages as its price. In a system of this sort, there is no room either for the work of the higher executive and inventor, or for that of the peasant. All one sees is manufactured goods, and oats or pigs. It will not be long before peasants and craftsmen have been quite forgotten, and the division of mankind into categories will, as with Marx, result in two only: the wage earner and the others, the, quote, exploiters, unquote. Thus arose the artificial division of humanity into the two classes, producers and purchasers, which in the hands of the class war theorists are falsely contrasted as capitalists and proletarians, bourgeoisie and labor, exploiters and exploited. Of the trader, however, the real capitalist, one hears nothing. The manufacturer or the farmer is the visible enemy, because he accepts hired labor and pays wages. The notion is senseless, but effective. The stupidity of a theory has never prevented its being effectively used. Criticism appertains to the author of a system. The believer is invariably uncritical. Capitalism and socialism are both of an age, intimately related, produced by the same outlook and burdened with the same tendencies. Socialism is nothing but the capitalism of the lower classes. The Manchester Free Trade doctrine of the Cobden and the communist system of Marx were both born in 1840 and in England. Marx even welcomed free trade capitalism. He said in 1847, quote, "Generally speaking, the protectionist system today is conservative, whereas the free trade system has a destructive effect. It destroys the former nationalities and renders the contrast between proletariat and bourgeoisie more acute. In a word, the free trade system is precipitating the social revolution, and only in this revolutionary sense do I vote for free trade." End quote. Quote, "Capitalism from below," unquote, wishes to sell its goods, namely paid labor, at as high a price as possible, without regard to the purchasing power of the buyer, and to supply as little as possible. Hence the hatred of the socialist parties for quality work and piece work, and their efforts to do away with the possible aristocratic distinction between the payment of skilled and unskilled labor. They wish to force up the price of manual work by means of strikes. The first general strike took place in England in 1841. And finally, by expropriating the factories and mines, to place the fixing of wages in the hands of the bureaucracy of the labor leaders, who at this stage will be in control of the state. For that is the undermeaning of state ownership. Capitalism from below describes the property that talented and superior people have worked to acquire as stolen in order to get enough fists clenched for it to be appropriated without work. This, then, is the origin of the class war theory, economically constructed with a view to the workers' vote, and politically designed for the benefit of the labor leader. It was a short-range aim. Inferior minds can see no further than the morrow in their outlook on the future, and they act accordingly. Class war was meant to bring destruction and nothing else. It was to clear away the forces of tradition, both political and economic, to give scope to the revenge and dominion of forces from the underworld. What lies in store beyond that victory, when class war has long passed away, no one in these circles has troubled to inquire. Thus, after 1840, the real and infinitely complicated economic life of the white nations was subjected to annihilating attacks from two sides. Attack from above, by the League of Financiers and Speculators, quote, "high finance," unquote, pervaded it with its bonds and credits and boards of directors, making the administrative work of professional entrepreneurs, among whom were numerous former employees who had worked their way up by industry and talent, dependent upon its intentions and interests. The actual economic employer sank to being the slave of the financier. He might be working for the success of a factory, while it was being ruined by a gamble on the stock exchange, of which he knew nothing. Attack from below, by the unions fashioned by the labor leaders, which set to work slowly but surely to destroy the economic organism. The theoretical weapon of the one is the scientific liberal economics, which forms public opinion on economic questions and brings its arguments and decisions to bear on legislation. The weapon of the other is the Communist Manifesto, the principles of which are likewise used to influence the legislature by the left of all parliaments. And both represent the principle of the international, which is purely nihilistic and negative. It is directed against the bounds set by the historical forms, and every form, every structure, is a setting of bounds, of the nation, the state, and the national economies, whose sum is world economy. All these stand in the way of both high finance and professional revolutionaries. Therefore, they are repudiated and marked for destruction. But both types of theory are now out of date. All that could be said has long been said, and both theories have been so thoroughly discredited since 1918 by their prophecies, whether concerning New York or Moscow, that although they continue to be quoted, no one believes in them. The world revolution began under the shadow of them. It has perhaps reached its height today, but it is far from being at an end, for it is assuming forms that are free from all theoretical twaddle. Subsection 15. And now, at last, it is possible to record the successes which the world revolution has achieved. For the revolution has reached its goal. It no longer menaces, it triumphs. It has won. And if its supporters argue the contrary to others, or to their own horrified consciences, this is but one more case of the fate that eternally in human history pursues the fighter. The realization, with cruel distinctness, that the goal reached is quite different from that aimed at, and, in most cases, that it was not worth the trouble. The success this time is enormous. It is for all white nations so terrifying that no one sees, or dares to see, all its implications. The originators have not the courage to acknowledge it as their work. Neither has the remnant of society, as it survives among the middle classes, the courage to confront them with the fact. The first part of the way from liberalism to Bolshevism was traversed in fighting against the political forces. Today these are destroyed, devoured, crushed. Once more, as in the Rome of the Gracchi, we are shown that everything that the few big and strong beasts of prey, the statesmen and conquerors, have created through the centuries can be gnawed away in a short time by the mass of small animals, the human vermin. The old and honorable forms of the state lie in ruins. They have been replaced by formless parliamentarism, a dust heap of what was once authority, art of governing and wisdom of state. And on it the parties, those hordes of business politicians, scramble for the booty. Dynastic sovereignty has been replaced by election, that each time brings new hordes of the unfit into state affairs. And among these parties, it is everywhere labor and its trade unions, pursuing political aims with economic means, and economic aims with political means. With their pooling of leader material programs and methods of agitation that have set the fashion for all. All seek to win over the masses of the great cities, pelt them with the same senseless hopes, and whip them on with the same accusations. Hardly a party now dares to suggest that it represents any other sections of the nations but the worker. Whether from cowardice or from hope of successes at the poll, they treat him almost without exception as a privileged class. In all countries, they have succeeded in demoralizing him, turning him into a most exacting, discontented, and therefore unhappy creature, putting him in the melting pot with the rabble of the streets to produce a like-minded unit, a class, to breed from him the type of proletarian in spirit, which by the mere fact of its existence guarantees revolutionary success, which despises industriousness and achievement as a betrayal of the cause, and whose highest ambition it is to become a leader of the masses and pillar of the revolution. It makes no difference whether these class war fronts have taken the form of bureaucratic parties or trade unions, such as the Marxian, Catholic, and National unions in Germany, and similar ones in England. Whether they have the Latin form of the anarchist and socialist clubs, as in Barcelona and Chicago, or whether they exist, as once in Russia and now in America, in underground movements, and only rally visibly at the moment of action. Once and all, they consist of controlling groups of professional demagogues, and a sheep-like following which has to serve the scarcely comprehended ultimate aim, and be sacrificed to it. The governments have long ago become their executives, either because the mass leaders themselves possess the parliamentary power, or because their opponents, hypnotized by the worker ideology, lack courage to think and act for themselves. They reign supreme in economics also, in this case using political means for a political object. And this object has never been lost sight of. Class war against the organic forces and forms of economic life known as capitalism. Since 1848, the ultimate aim is its annihilation, and this has now been achieved. The world economic crisis of this year, and a good many next years, is not, as the whole world supposes, the temporary consequence of war, revolution, inflation, and payments of debts. It has been willed. In all essentials, it is the product of the deliberate work of the leaders of the proletariat. Its roots lie far deeper than is thought. Its effects are only to be overcome in long, hard battles against everything that is popular today. And much of this can never now be undone. Courage to see what is actually happening would be the initial requirement, and I fear that the stock of this is very low. At no time has the whole world shown such cowardice before the general opinion of the parliaments, parties, speakers, and writers. They are all on their knees before the people, the masses, the proletariat, or whatever they may call that which blindly and unsuspectingly serves as a weapon for the leaders of the world revolution. Their reproach of being, quote, the enemy of the worker, unquote, causes every politician to blanch. But who, then, really won the World War? Certainly not any state, neither France, nor England, nor America, nor white labor, though it did to a great extent pay for it, first with its blood on the field, then with its standard of life in the economic crisis. It was the noblest victim of its leaders. It was ruined for their ends. The labor leader was the one who won the war. That which in every country is called the Labor Party and the trade union, but is in reality the trade union of party officials, the bureaucracy of the revolution, gained the mastery, and is now ruling over Western civilization. It has driven the proletariat from strike to strike, from street fight to street fight, and has itself proceeded from one devastating parliamentary resolution to another, either in virtue of its own power, or because of the terror in the beaten middle classes. Either in virtue of its own power, or because of the terror of the beaten middle classes. The governments, everywhere in the world, have since 1916 become more and more rapidly dependent on them, and are obliged to obey their orders if they do not wish to be overthrown. These brutish inroads into the structure and meaning of economic life they must either allow to be made, or make them themselves. Such attacks are wholly in the interests of the lowest grade of labor, the merest hands, and take the form of extravagant raising of wages and reduction of working hours, of devastating taxes on the profits of the management, on old family property, on industry, and on the peasantry. The sack of society has been accomplished. It was the reward of the mercenaries in the class war. The natural center of gravity of the economic body, the economic judgments of the real experts, was replaced by an artificial, non-expert, party political one. The equilibrium was destroyed and the structure collapsed. But this had been for decades the openly avowed intention of Western Bolshevism, and so economic catastrophe was a tactical victory, little as labor had suspected or intended it. This overthrow of capitalism, prefigured ever since 1840, and enthusiastically lauded by Bebel, this, quote, last judgment, unquote, on the bourgeoisie, ought, it is true, to have automatically brought about the longed-for dictatorship of the proletariat, that is, of its creators and leaders. It has not done so, we think, and yet, has it not? Quite apart from Moscow, what but this was the trade union republic in Germany? Is not economic, bureaucratically administered socialism the reigning idea in the national labor parties of Germany, England, and even Italy? Have not the men with the creative economic ideas, the promoters of private economic enterprise, been sacrificed to this dictatorship on the platform of world economic ruin? The economic leader, the expert in economic life, has been ousted by the party leader who, if he know nothing of economics, knows all there is to know about demagogic propaganda. He rules as a bureaucrat in the drafting of economic legislation, which has displaced the free decisions of the man who knows, as leading spirit in the countless committees, courts of arbitration, conferences, cabinet meetings, and whatever the forms of his dictatorship may call themselves, and even in the fascist ministry of corporations. He is out for state socialism, for the elimination of private initiative, for economic planning. all of which mean the same thing: communism. No matter if the worker be sacrificed with the boss, the professional labor leader has at last the desired power in his hands, and is able to avenge the underworld against those who, by the accident of birth which endowed them with talents and natural superiority, were called to see things from above and to govern. I am well aware that most people will refuse with horror to admit that this irrevocable crashing of everything that centuries have gone to build was intentional, the result of deliberate working to that end. But so it is. There is proof of it. The process began as soon as the professional revolutionaries of Marx's generation had realized that, in Northwest Europe, the dependence of industry on coal had become the vital factor of economic life. The bare existence of the growing masses of the nations depended on its flourishing. As regards England, this was already the case. As to Germany, they were hopeful, and the doctrinaires who viewed the world diagrammatically as bourgeoisie and proletariat assumed as a matter of course that the same development must take place elsewhere. But how did it stand with Spain and Italy, who had no coal? Or even with France, not to mention Russia? It is amazing how narrow the horizon of these theologians of the class war was and remained, and how little this has been realized until our day. Did they ever include Africa, Asia, or Latin America in the sphere of their economic researches and prophecies? Did they waste one thought on the colored workers of the tropical colonies? Were they aware that these were omitted, and why they had to be omitted? They talked of the future of, quote, humanity, unquote, and instead of taking the whole planet into their field of vision, they stared fixedly at a few European countries, whose state and society they intended to destroy. In the case of these, however, they saw that this would be possible if they paralyzed the vitality of industry, and the systematic attack upon it began with the attempts to make its organized working impossible. This was done in the first place by forcibly reducing the daily hours of wage earners in factories, in contrast to the higher work of executives, inventors, and engineers. In the 18th century, the working day amounted to more than 12 hours, though without being legally fixed, this being the usual practice among Nordic peasants and artisans. At the beginning of the 19th century, it was limited in England to 12 hours, and about 1850 was again reduced by the 10-hour bill, which incidentally was fiercely opposed by the workers themselves. When this bill was finally passed, it was acclaimed in revolutionary circles as a victory for the working class, and, rightly, as the crippling of industry. The blow, it was believed, would be fatal. From that time, the trade unions of all countries undertook to exert increasing pressure to reduce the working day still more, and to extend the rule to all wage earners. Towards the end of the century, the limit was 9 hours, and at the end of the World War, 8 hours. Today, as we approach the middle of the 20th century, the 40-hour work week is the minimum of the revolutionary demand. Since at the same time the ban on Sunday work is more strictly enforced, the individual worker delivers only half of the original, possible, and natural quantum of what he has to sell, namely, labor. And thus, the quote, worker, unquote, who according to the Marxian doctrine is the only one who works, has become, to a great extent unwillingly, the one who works the least. What profession would tolerate so slight an output? This was the fighting method of the strike in a disguised, slowly penetrating form. It first took on meaning through the fact that the price of this form of goods, the weekly wage, was not only not reduced, but was forced steadily upwards. Now, the value, the actual product of the work done, is not an independent quantity. It is a result obtained from the organic whole of industrial labor, in which the administrative work of controlling and regulating operations, the obtaining of materials, the marketing of products, the thinking out of costs and yield, of layout and equipment, and of new possibilities, are of far greater importance. The total output depends upon the order and the amount of headwork, not handwork, that is put into it. If there is no yield, if the product is unsaleable, then the work put into the process has been valueless, and ought really not to be paid for at all. This is what happens to the peasant and the craftsman. But through the activities of the trade unions, the hourly wage of the handworker has been removed from the unit of the organism. It is settled by the party leader, not by the economic leader, and if the latter does not and cannot consent to it, It is enforced by strikes, sabotage, and pressure on Parliament. In the last 100 years, it has risen by a great deal in proportion to the earnings of peasants and craftsmen. Everyone actively employed in the economic system is dependent for his gain on the economic situation itself. Everybody except the wage-earning workman. He has a claim to the wage level that is fixed inorganically and fought for by party political means, even when it can only be maintained by allowing works to fall into decay, cutting out profits altogether, and selling goods at less than a cost price, until the factories themselves give in, and a malicious feeling of triumph runs through the ranks of the labor leaders, who have once more won a victory on the road to their eventual goal. Today, when the birth of the class war theory is nearly 100 years behind us, and no one any longer really believes in it, it seems doubtful whether these leaders are still conscious of the end for which all this work of destruction was originally designed and started. There is, however, a tradition and method which over long years has grown up among them, by which they are bound to work unceasingly for reduction of work and increase of wages. It is this which proves their ability in the eyes of the party. And if today the original dogmatic meaning is forgotten and the good conscience of the believer is lacking, the effect is still there, though it may be traced back to other causes. A new means of agitation, the finding of a new sin against the working class, which may be fathered upon capitalism. Once the doctrine of, quote, surplus value, unquote, had power to sway the undeveloped reasoning of the masses, the whole output of industrial production was equal to the value of executive manual labor and had to be allotted accordingly. What the manufacturer deducted from it, for upkeep of the works, payment for raw materials, salaries, interest, the surplus value, in fact, was robbery. The administration, the inventors, the engineers, all did no work whatsoever, and if they had done, mental work such as theirs, which was a kind of doing nothing, had no real value. It was the same democratic tendency which scorned and would have destroyed quality of any sort, and thought only in terms of quantity, even in manual work. The, quote, aristocratic, unquote, distinction between skilled and unskilled labor had to be abolished. Both should receive equal payment. Piecework and superior production were branded as betrayal of the cause. This attitude has triumphed, and post-war Germany in particular is its triumph. It has eliminated competition among the workers, stifled the impulse to attain higher levels of skill, and thereby reduced the total output. That all this was nihilism, the will to destruction, we see from the practice prevailing in Moscow today. There, the situation of 1840 was reestablished in every respect as soon as, quote, the goal, unquote, had been realized. Long working hours, low wages, the widest possible gulf, wider even than America, between the payment of skilled and of unskilled work, and the importation of foreign engineers to replace their own, who had been killed off as, according to the doctrine of the Communist Manifesto, they merely exploited the worker without doing anything. Their worth was not realized until later. The idea that the worker had a right to the full value of his work, which was equated with the total yield of the undertaking, persisted until the end of the century. This, at least, set a natural limit for the wage demands. But side by side with and out of it arose, from about the 70s onward, the far from theoretical method of forcing up wages by the political pressure of the workers' organizations. It was no longer a question of the limits fixed by the economic system to this exploitation in favor of the one class, but only of the limits of political, parliamentary, or revolutionary power. In almost all white countries, about the turn of the century, and in Germany most conspicuously after 1918, there existed, side by side with the constitutional government, a subsidiary one, consisting of trade unions of every variety. Its task was primarily to feed the electorate with wages, and purchase the right to do so from the bourgeois powers by granting them permission to govern. The, quote, working class vote, unquote, handled as such by all party leaders, had become the decisive factor for everything to which parliaments dared to commit themselves. Thus, the political wage, for which there were no longer any natural economic limits, became an established fact. The wage tariffs, which the state was bound to support, were fixed by the party, not calculated economically, and the high tariff of trade unions became a right to which no bourgeois party or government dared touch or call into question. The political wage soon outdistanced the full value of the work. It drove industry in the white countries to desperate measures of self-help and self-preservation, and so landed it in the tangled situation of which the result is the world economic catastrophe now before us. Wage Bolshevism, working through strikes, sabotage, elections, and government crises, drained so much blood from the economic life of nations, not Germany's alone, that fevered efforts had to be made to make good these losses by every imaginable device. We must realize how comprehensive is the term, quote, political wage, unquote, before we can estimate the pressure of this wage dictatorship on the economic life of nations. Reaching out far beyond money payment, it embraces concern for the worker's whole existence, the burden of which is taken from him to be loaded onto the rest. The worker has become a pensioner of society and of the nation. Every human being has, like every animal, to defend himself against the incalculable workings of destiny, or to submit to them. Each has his own personal cares, full responsibility for himself, and must inevitably make his own decisions in all dangers threatening himself and his aims. No one dreams of relieving, at the expense of others, farmers from the consequences of bad harvests, cattle disease, fire, and failing markets, or artisans, doctors, engineers, tradespeople, and scientists from the threat of economic ruin and unfitness for work, owing to insufficient qualifications, sickness, or accident. Each of these has to deal with such things himself, and at his own expense, or else bear the consequences and beg or go under in any other way he pleases. Such is life. The craving to insure oneself against old age, accident, sickness, unemployment, in short, against fate in every conceivable form, which is a sign of sinking vitality, beginning from Germany, has now embedded itself in one way or another in the mentality of all white nations. The victim of misfortune cries out to others without any will to help himself. But there is a difference which denotes the victory of Marxian thought over the original Germanic, individualistic instincts of delight and responsibility, and of the personal struggle with fate, the amor fati. All the rest, in seeking to evade or to meet the unforeseen, do so according to their own resolve and in their own strength. It is only the worker who is spared this decision. He alone can rest assured that others will think and act for him. The degenerating effect of this freedom from all responsibility, which is seen similarly in children of very rich parents, has overtaken the whole working class, especially in Germany. At the first sign of any distress, appeal for help is made to the state, the party, society, or, in any case, others. We have forgotten how to take decisions ourselves, and to live under the stress of real anxiety. But this means a further burden laid upon the higher work in the community for the benefit of the lower. For this part of the political wage also, insurance of every kind against fate, the building of workers' dwellings, no one thinks of demanding these for farm laborers, the construction of playgrounds, convalescent homes, libraries, and the special terms for food, railway journeys, and amusements, is all paid for directly or indirectly by taxation of the rest for the working man. This is in fact an essential part of the political wage, and it receives very little thought. At the same time, the national wealth of which we are given the amount in figures is an economic fiction. It is calculated as capital from the yield of economic undertakings, or from the market prices of interest-bearing shares, and it falls with these when the value of the working factories is threatened by the burden of high wages. A factory is thus made to close down, is, however, of no more value except for the scrap heap. Under the dictatorship of the trade unions, Germany's economic system has, in the 4 years 1925 to 9, to meet an extra load of 18,225,000,000 marks annually, in respect of increased wages, taxes, and grants for social purposes. This means 1/3 of the national income spent one-sidedly. 1 year later, the sum had grown to far beyond 20 milliard marks. What are 2 milliards for reparations compared with this? It endangered the financial position of the Reich and the currency. Its drag on the economic system was not even taken into account when the effects of wage Bolshevism were in question. It was the expropriation of the whole economic system in the interests of one class. Subsection 16. There is higher work and lower. Nothing can deny or alter this truth. It is the expression of the fact that culture exists. The higher the stage of the development of a culture, the more powerful its creative force, the greater the difference between determining and subordinate actions of all kinds, whether political, economic, or artistic. For culture is ordered, intellectualized life, a maturing and self-perfecting form, which calls for an ever higher grade of personality. There is work for which one must have an inner call, and other work that one must do, because one can do nothing better than to earn a living. There is work for which only a very few men of superior rank are competent, and other work which is valuable only in terms of duration and volume. Whichever it is, one is born into it. That is fate. It cannot be altered either by rationalist or by sentimental romantic equality talk. The global output of work for which the Western culture is responsible, which is identical with it, becomes greater every century. At the time of the Reformation, it amounted to many times what it had been at the age of the Crusades, and it grew to immense size in the 18th century in response to the dynamism of creative leaders' work, which had, of necessity, made the demands for the lower type of mass labor greater and greater. But it is for that very reason that the proletarian revolutionary, who sees culture from below and, not possessing it himself, is unable to understand it, seeks to destroy it, to do without quality work, or any work even. If there are no more men having culture, to his mind they are a luxury and a superfluity, there will be less work, and, above all, inferior work, which anyone can do. I once read in a socialist paper that when the money millionaires have been abolished, the brain millionaires must be sent after them. Real creative work is a vexation to such people. They hate its superiority and envy its success, whether the result takes the form of power or of wealth. The chairwoman of a hospital is of more importance to them than the principal physician. The plowman is worth more than the farmer, who improves the grain and breeds pedigree cattle. The stoker more than the inventor of the engine. A transvaluation of economic values, to use a Nietzschean phrase, has come about, and as, in the eyes of the masses, any value translates itself into money, into pay, the lower grade mass labor ought to be better paid than the higher work of outstanding personalities. And this is being brought about. There have been consequences that no one has yet really understood. The white worker, whom Labor Party leaders and cowardly middle class vie with each other in flattering and spoiling, is becoming a luxury animal. Do let us leave out idiotic comparison with millionaires who are well off. It is not a question of people who live in palaces and keep armies of servants. Take a modern industrial worker's private cost of living and compare it with that of a yeoman. About 1840, the mode of living was much the same for both. Today, the former works far less than the other, but the manner in which the peasant, whether in Pomerania, Yorkshire, or Kansas, lives, feeds, and clothes himself, contrasts so pitifully with what a metal worker, from the Ruhr area to Pennsylvania, spends on his keep, and above all on his amusements, that the latter would immediately strike at the suggestion that he should ever again take up this way of life with twice the work, and perpetual anxiety over bad harvests, markets, and debts, into the bargain. That which appears as the minimum for existence, and is regarded as poverty in the great northern cities, would seem extravagant in a village an hour's journey away. Not to mention the style of living in the area of the South European land communism, where the simplicity of the colored races still exists. But this luxury of the working classes is a fact, and who pays for it? Not the work that is done. Their output is not worth so much by a long way. It is others who have to work, all the rest of the nation, to meet it. There are fools, and if Ford was serious in what he said and wrote, he is one of them, who believe that the workers' increased purchasing power will preserve the level of economic life. But did those unoccupied masses in Rome after the Gracchan period do so? People talk of the home market, without considering what this really is. Let this new dogma of the white trade unions be tested. Pay the worker not in money, but in the products of his own labor, in locomotives, chemicals, and paving stones, and let his business be to sell them. He would not know what to do with them. He would be horrified to find how little these things are worth. It would also transpire that the same degree of culture, the same intellectualized taste, is needed for the intelligent spending of money as for earning it by superior achievement. Luxury can be elegant or vulgar, and no one can alter that fact. It is the difference between a Mozart opera and a musical comedy, but the luxury wage is definitely not the complement of a refined craving for luxurious conditions. It is only the purchasing power of a higher rank of society that makes quality industry possible. The lower orders merely feed an entertainment industry, as in ancient Rome. But this vulgar luxury of great cities, little work, much money, and still more amusement, exercised a fatal influence upon the hard-working and simple men of the open country. They learned to know of needs of which their fathers would never have let themselves dream. Self-denial is hard when one has the opposite before one. The flight from the land set in. First the farm hands and maids went, then the farmers' sons, and in the end whole families who did not know whether or how they could uphold the paternal heritage in the face of all this distortion of economic life. It has been the same of all cultures at that stage. There is no truth in the belief that Italy became depopulated after Hannibal's time by the large landed estates. It was the panem et circenses of cosmopolitan Rome that did it. And it was only when the land had lost its population and become worthless that the farming of large estates by the means of slaves developed. Otherwise, it would have become a wilderness. The depopulation of the villages began in England in 1840, in Germany in the 1880s, in the Middle West of the United States in 1920. The peasant is tired of working without wages when the town offers him wages without work. So away he goes, to become a proletarian. The worker himself was innocent in the matter. He does not feel his mode of life to be luxurious. Quite the contrary. He became wretched and dissatisfied, like every unearning, privileged person. That which yesterday was the object of extravagant desires has today become a matter of course, and by tomorrow will be a state of distress calling loudly for help. The labor leader spoiled this man when he appointed him a praetorian of the class war. At the time of the Communist Manifesto, he was to be made morally a proletarian to this end. Now he is encouraged, to the same end, to hope that he will one day no longer be one. But in the one case, as in the other, the unjustified level of the political wage has led to more and more things becoming indispensable. But can this wage, which has become an independent quantity alongside those of economics, possibly be paid any longer? What with? By whom? Close inspection shows that the concept of economic profits has undergone an imperceptible change under the pressure of the forcing up of wages. Only a healthy economic life can be productive. There is a natural, unforced profit as long as the wages involved in a process are functionally dependent on it. Once this becomes an independent, a political, quantity, an uninterrupted bloodletting which no living body can stand, there begins an artificial, morbid way of estimating economic operation. A race between the market, which must keep on top if the whole is not to collapse and bleed away, and the hurrying advance of wages, with the accompanying taxes and the social contributions which are indirect taxes. The feverish tempo of increasing production comes chiefly from the secret wound in the economic life. The incitement to buy luxuries is diffused by every form of advertisement. The foreign market among colored peoples is extended and imposed by force. The economic imperialism of the great industrial states, which uses military means to secure market areas and keep them to their role as such, is intensified by the urge of self-preservation of the heads of industry, who have to hold their own under the perpetual political wage pressure of labor. From the moment that a real or apparent recovery of industry occurs in any part of the white world, the trade unions put in new wage claims in order to secure for their followers profits which are actually non-existent. In Germany, when the reparations payments were suspended, it was at once assumed that these savings must go to benefit the working class. The natural result of luxury wages was an increase in the cost of production, and correspondingly, a fall in the value of money. And here too there was political intervention, in that selling prices were maintained or lowered by statute to secure the purchasing power of the wages. Thus, the repeal of the Corn Laws in England about 1850 was a disguised form of wage increase. Its effect was to sacrifice the agricultural laborer to the industrial worker, and since then, this has been attempted or actually carried out everywhere, owing in part to the absurd economic pronouncement of bankers and other experts that the world should be divided into agrarian and industrial countries in order to obtain a practicable organization of world economy. What, in these circumstances, was to become of the peasant class in the industrial countries, no one inquired. It was the mere object in labor politics, the enemy to the monopoly interest of labor. All labor organizations are hostile to the land workers, whether they admit it or contest it. Similarly, the price of coal and iron was fixed under parliamentary pressure, without regard to the cost of extraction, though this is bound up with these very wages. All sorts of special prices for the working class were also insisted upon, and these had then to be made good by a rise in the normal prices for the rest. If this damaged or even ruined the market, that was the private affair of the entrepreneurs, and the more their position was shaken, the more triumphant the trade unions felt themselves. One result of the effects of this class war was the increasing need of productive industry for credit, for capital, that is to say, for imaginary money values, which are there only as long as one believes in their existence, and when the least doubt arises, dissolve into nothingness in the form of a crash on the stock exchange. It was a despairing attempt to replace the lost real values by phantom values. The heyday of a new and wily banking method had set in, by which enterprises were financed and at the same time controlled by the banks, which not only gave credit, but created it on paper, a ghost-like, homeless, and airy finance capital. Old family properties have been more and more rapidly converted into joint stock companies, made fluid, so that the money thus raised might fill the gaps in the circulation of expenditure and receipts. The indebtedness of productive industry, for shares are at bottom nothing but a debt, grew to fabulous proportions, and when the necessity of paying interest on it, as well as wages, began to look threatening for the latter, the final weapon of the class war was brought out, the demand for expropriation of the works by the state. By this means, wages are to be definitely withdrawn from the economic balance sheet and regarded as state salaries, which will be fixed by the governing labor parties at will, and for which the means of the rest of the nation will be commandeered by fiscal Bolshevism. The final decisive results of this folly of luxury wages have become increasingly apparent since 1900. The growing desolation of the agricultural countryside brought ever greater crowds into the sphere of the panem and circenses of the cities, and tempted industry to enlarge its undertakings, no misgivings as to the disposal of the products having yet arisen. Between 1900 and 1914, 15 million of the country folk from South and East Europe migrated to the United States, where the farming population was already on the decrease. In the north of Europe, there was internal migration to the same amount. In the mining area of Brie, for instance, there were in 1914 more Polish and Italian than French miners. And then Nemesis overtook this development from a side which the class war leaders have never taken into account, and indeed never noticed. Marx both admired and hated the industrial system of the white countries of the North as the masterpiece of the bourgeoisie. He had eyes only for the home of it in England, France, and Germany, and his successors accepted this provincial horizon as the orthodox premise of all tactical considerations. But the world was bigger than that, was something more than an area which meekly and obediently absorbed the exports of little northern Europe. The mass of white workers lived not by industry itself, but by the industrial monopoly of the northern great powers. Only on the basis of this fact could the political wage be paid without leading to immediate catastrophe. But outside and beyond the class war of the working class with society within the field of white nations, a race struggle of quite other dimensions raised its head. No labor leader had foreseen it, and no one to this day has realized, or dared to realize, the fateful relentlessness of its advance. The competition of white workers among themselves had been suppressed by trade union organization and wage tariffs. The difference that had grown up since 1840 between the standard of living of the industrial worker and the land worker presented no dangers, as all the political economic rulings, customs, taxes, statutes, were unilateral, made by the industrial side against the agricultural. But in the new struggle, it was the colored workers' standard of living which competed with the luxury wage of the white working class. Colored wages are a quantity of different orders and different origins from those of the white. They are dictated, not demanded, and are kept down if necessary by force of arms. This is not called reaction or injustice to the proletariat, but colonial policy. And the English worker, at least, has been quite agreeable to it, having learned to think imperially. In demanding the full value of the proceeds as the workers' wages, Marx tried to suppress one fact which it would have been more honest to note and take account of. The proceeds of the northern industries include the cost of the tropical raw materials, cotton, rubber, metals, and this in turn includes the low wages of colored labor. The overpayment of white labor therefore depends upon the underpayment of colored labor. Similarly, the purchasing power of white wages is increased by the fact that the home agriculture has to face the competition of supplies produced on colored wages, while it itself is tied to the high scales of wages and expense generally. Soviet Russia prides itself on the tactics of undercutting by which it attacks the vitality of the white economic system, namely, the setting back of its own working class, if necessary by starving them or, as in Moscow in 1923, shelling them. But as a matter of fact, the method has been in progress of development for a long time, and without any forcing, all over the globe. And it struck with terrific effect, not so much on the quality of Western industrialism, as on the very existence of the white working class. Were the Soviets so dogma-blinded as to not see this? Or were they the heralds of the will to annihilate, of the Asiatic race consciousness that is awakening, and means to exterminate the Western culture peoples? In the South African mines, whites and Kaffirs work side by side. The whites for 8 hours at the rate of 2 shillings per hour, the Kaffirs for 12 hours at the rate of 1 shilling a day. This grotesque disproportion is maintained by the white trade unions, which veto any attempt of the colored workers to organize themselves and bring pressure to bear on their political parties to prevent the ejection of whites, lock, stock, and barrel, although this is the obvious course. But this is only one example of the general situation between white and colored labor all the world over. Japanese industry is driving its white competitors out of the field in every part of southern and eastern Asia by its low wages, and has already made the appearance on the European and American market of such goods. Indian textile goods are seen in London, and in the midst of this, a fearful thing is happening. As late as 1880, the only exploited coal measures lay in northern Europe and North America. Now they have been discovered and opened up in every continent. White labor's monopoly on coal has completely vanished. And what is even more serious, industry has freed itself to a very large extent from dependence on coal through water power, oil, and electrical power transmission. It is now free to move about, and it does so. What is more, it moves everywhere away from the domain of the white trade union dictatorships into countries with low wages. The dispersion of Western industry has been in full swing since 1900. The mills of India were established as branches of English factories, with the idea of getting nearer to the customer. Such was the original intention, but the West European luxury wage has led to a very different result. In the United States, industry has migrated more and more from Chicago and New York to the Negro areas in the South, and it will not halt at the Mexican frontier. There are growing industrial areas in China, Java, South Africa, South America. The flight of highly developed techniques to the color areas continues, and the white luxury working wage is beginning to be rather theoretical, since the work by which it is earned is no longer wanted. Subsection 17. Even by 1900, the danger was immense. The structure of the white economic system was already undermined. It threatened to break down at the first world historical upheaval under the load of the political wage. The reduced hours of work that men would stand, the saturation of all foreign markets, and the emergence of foreign industrial areas, which were outside the jurisdiction of white labor parties. Only the unbelievable peace after 1870, which was diffused over the white world by its statesmen' dread of making incalculable decisions, maintained the universal delusion vis-à-vis the catastrophe that was approaching with sinister speed. The gloomy presages of its coming were not noticed, or not seriously considered. A fateful, shallow, almost criminal optimism. The faith in unswerving progress, as expressed in figures, dominated the leaders of labor and of industry alike, not to mention the politicians, and found support in the morbid inflation of the fictitious finance capital which all the world took to be real property, real and indestructible money value. But even by 1910, individual voices had been heard recalling that the world was in the process of being satiated with the products of industry, including those of industrialized large-scale farming. Here and there, proposals were made for an agreement between the powers upon a voluntary quota system of production, but there was no response. No one believed in any serious dangers. No one wanted to believe in them. And in any case, the premises were unsound, as such propositions came from one-sided observers who saw the economic system as an independent quantity, and not as the expression of something far stronger, the policy of creeping world revolution which had forced economics into wrong forms and tendencies. The causes lay too deep to even be touched by inquiries into the crisis and trade cycle problems. And it was already too late. One more short breathing space of self-delusion was permitted, the preparation for the World War, which claimed innumerable hands, or at any rate withdrew them from production work, as soldiers of the standing armies, or as workers in war industries. Then came the Great War, and with it, not caused by it, but merely no longer averted, the economic collapse of the white world. It would have come in any case, only more slowly and less appalling forms. But this war was waged from the first by England, the home of practical labor socialism, for the economic destruction of Germany, the youngest great power, the economic unit which was developing the most rapidly and on superior lines, and for her perpetual exclusion as competitor in the world's markets. The more completely statesmanlike thinking foundered in the chaos of events, leaving only military and crude economic tendencies in the field. The more clearly everywhere emerged the somber hope of ruining first Germany, then Russia, then the individual powers of the Entente, and finally the home industrial and financial position, and so of rescuing the home workers from the impossible situation. But even that was not the actual beginning of the catastrophe that followed, which developed out of the fact that, after 1916, the dictatorship of the working classes vis-à-vis state government had established itself, openly or secretly, in all white countries, whether actively engaged in the war or no, and that, although varying greatly in form and degree, it followed invariably the same revolutionary tendency. It overthrew or controlled all governments. It wormed its way into all armies and navies. It was, and rightly, more dreaded than the war itself. And after the war was ended, it worked up the wages of inferior mass labor to a grotesque height, and at the same time imposed the 8-hour day. When the workers came home from the war, there arose everywhere in the world, despite the enormous loss in human lives, the famous house famine, due to the desire of the victorious proletarian to live under middle-class conditions, and his achievement of it. It was the pathetic symbol of the fall of all the ancient powers of class and rank. Seen from this aspect, the universal inflation of state finances and economic credits was for the first time understood for what it was, one of the most effective forms of Bolshevism, by which the ruling classes of society might be dispossessed, ruined, proletarianized, and as a result, excluded from political government. Since then, the world has been ruled by the low, short-sighted thought of the vulgar man who has suddenly come into power. That was the victory. The destruction is complete. The future is almost hopeless. But the spirit of revenge upon society is appeased. Meanwhile, things now appear as they are. The pitiless logic of history takes its revenge on the avengers, on the vulgar mentality, on the envious, the dreamers, the enthusiasts, who have been blind to the great and chilling facts of reality. 30 million white workers are workless today, in spite of the great war losses, and leaving out of account those other millions who are only partially occupied. This is not the result of the war, for half of them live in countries which only took barely any part, or no part at all, in the war. Neither is it a result of war debts or misguided currency maneuvers, such as other countries can show. Unemployment stands everywhere in exact proportion to the height of the political wage tariffs. It hits the individual countries in exact proportion to the respective numbers of white industrial workers. In the United States, it is first the Anglo-Americans, whose labor is no longer required, then the East and Southeast European immigrants, and finally, a long way behind them, the Negroes. It is just the same in Latin America and South America. In France, the number is smaller, primarily because her socialistic deputies know the difference between theory and practice, and sell themselves with all speed to the reigning financiers instead of extorting wages to their constituents. But in Russia, Japan, China, and India, there is no lack of work, because there are no luxury wages. Industry has fled to the colored races, and in white countries, only the labor-saving inventions and methods pay for themselves, because they relieve the wage pressure. For decades now, the increase of production with the same number of workers by means of technical refinements has been the ultimate means of enduring this pressure. Now it can no longer be borne, because the markets are lacking. Formerly, the wages of Birmingham, Essen, and Pittsburgh provided the world standard, but now this is given by the colored wage of Java, Rhodesia, and Peru. And to that must be added the leveling down of the aristocratic society of the white nations, with their inherited wealth, their gradually acquired taste, their need of real luxury, which sets the example to others. The Bolshevism of the death duties and super taxes, levied at the dictates of envy, in England even before the war, and the inflations which transformed whole fortunes into nothing, have done their work thoroughly. But it is this genuine luxury that had created and maintained quality work, had allowed entire quality industries to grow up, and had kept them alive. It tempted and educated the middle strata to greater refinement in its own demands. The greater this luxury, the more flourishing the economic system. Napoleon of old knew this. He did not concern himself with economic theories, and was the better able to understand the economic life. It was from his court that the impulse came to revive the economic system, which the Jacobins had destroyed. For a higher social order was again being formed. On the English model, it is true, because the old regime was murdered or ruined, save for some impoverished remnants. When the wealth that has accumulated among the ruling class is annihilated by the mob, when it becomes an object of suspicion and scorn, a danger to the other, then the Nordic will to acquire property, will to power through property, ceases to create that wealth. Economic, spiritual, ambition dries out. Competition no longer pays. We sit in corners, go without things, and save. And this saving, which always means the saving of other people's work, inevitably drives every highly developed economy to disaster. All this works together. Low-grade white labor is worthless. The labor mass in the northern coal areas has become superfluous. It is the first great defeat of the white nations by the mass of the colored nations, which embraces Russians, South Spaniards, and South Italians, and the peoples of Islam, just as much as the Negroes of English-speaking America and the Indians of Latin America. It is the first menacing sign that white world supremacy is faced with the possibility of an overthrow by the forces of color, as the result of the class war in its rear. And no one withal dares to look into the real causes of this catastrophe, or down into its abysses. The white world is governed primarily by idiots, if it is governed at all, which one is entitled to doubt. Around the sickbed of the white economic system stand ridiculous authorities who can see no further ahead than next year, and from their narrow and long obsolete economic capitalistic, socialistic standpoints, discuss minor palliatives. And finally, cowardice makes blind. No one speaks of the consequences of this century, and more of the world revolution which has risen from its depths of our great cities and destroyed economic life. And not that alone. No one sees it. No one dares to see it. The, quote, working man, unquote, is now, as before, the idol of the world, and the labor leader is placed above criticism in deference to the tendency for which his existence stands. For all the loud abuse of Marxism, Marxism itself speaks in every word of it. Its most wholehearted opponents are, all unwittingly, obsessed by it. And every one of us is a bit of a socialist or a communist in the bottom of his heart. Hence, the universal unwillingness to admit the fact of the prevailing class war, and to deduce its consequences. Instead of ruthlessly opposing the causes of the catastrophe, so far as that is all possible, we try to suppress the results, the symptoms, and not even to suppress them, but to whitewash, conceal, and deny them. There is not the beginning of any reconsideration of the revolutionary wage level, but the new revolutionary demand for a 40-hour week, a further step on the way to Marxism, a further curtailment of white labor's output without reduction of income, a further rise in the cost of white labor, that is, for it is axiomatic that the political wage must not fall. No one dares to tell the mass of the workers that their victory has been their heaviest defeat, that labor leaders and labor parties have led them to it for the sake of appeasing their own hunger for popularity, power, and well-paid posts, and that these are still far from the idea of releasing their victims and effacing themselves. But all the time, the colored races are working long and cheaply, right to the limit of their working capacity. In Russia under the knout, but elsewhere with the silent conviction that already they hold the hated white men, their masters of today, or of yesterday, in their power. Then there is that catchword of abolishing unemployment, providing employment, that is to say, superfluous, useless work, since there is no longer any essential, profitable, useful work to be had in these conditions. And no one admits to himself that the cost of this production without a market, of these faked Potemkin villages in an economic wilderness, must sometime be made good by means of fiscal Bolshevism, which includes provision of fictitious means of payment from the relics of the healthy peasant class in urban society. Then, again, there is dumping by means of systematic depreciation of the currency, whereby one particular country seeks to maintain a market for its products at the expense of others. This is at bottom a false and all too easy miscalculation of real wages and real costs of production, by which the buyer is deceived and of which, once more, what is left of the property of the rest of the nation has to bear the costs in the form of depreciation of values. But the fall of the pound, a huge sacrifice for England's pride, did not diminish the number of the unemployed. No, not by one man. There is only one form of dumping which has its natural roots in economic life and is therefore successful: the form of cheaper wages and greater output of labor. This is the basic reason for the destructive influence of Russian exports, and of the factual superiority of the colored areas of production like Japan, whether they are engaged in industry or agriculture, and whether they are killing white production by their own exports, or by exporting themselves, or by keeping home products so cheap as to exclude imports. Finally, there is the last desperate measure resorted to by the mortally stricken economies of nations: autarky, or whatever big word may be chosen to describe this attitude of the dying animal. It manifests itself in the reciprocal putting down of economic barrages by political methods, by hostile tariffs, import prohibitions, boycotts, blockage of currency transfers, and everything else that has been or will be invented to establish a, quote, state of siege, unquote, that almost represents actual war conditions, and may one day put it into the heads of the militarily stronger powers that such gates may possibly be opened, and economic capitulation enforced by a timely allusion to tanks and bombing squadrons. For again, be it said, the economic system is no self-contained kingdom. It is inseparably bound up with world politics. It is unthinkable without a strong foreign policy, and therefore, in the last resort, it is dependent upon the military strength of the country in which it lives or dies. But what is the sense of defending a fortress if the enemy is within it? If treason in the form of class war leaves it doubtful whom and what one is really defending? Here lie the real and difficult problems of our time. But the raison d'etre of grave questions is precisely that they should call forth the best effort of the best brains. And when we see how, all the world over, they are whittled down, lied down, to the level of small fictitious problems, so that small men with small ideas and small expedients can make themselves important, when the guilt of the economic catastrophe is laid upon the war and the war debts, on inflation and currency difficulties, and when, quote, returning to prosperity, unquote, and ending unemployment are all that people can find to say, and say unblushingly, about the finale of an overwhelming world historical epic, then maybe we do well to despair of the future. We live in one of the mightiest ages in all history, and no one sees, no one realizes it. We are experiencing a volcanic eruption that is without parallel. Night has set in, the earth trembles, and streams of lava are rolling down over entire nations. And we send for the fire brigade. But this is the mob all over. Mob rule, in contrast to the handful of the thoroughbreds. It is the great individuals who make history, and whatever presents itself en masse can only be its object. Subsection 18. This world revolution, however, is not over. It will outlast the middle, and possibly the end, of the century. It strides on unchecked towards its ultimate decisions, with the historical ruthlessness of a great destiny, which no past civilization has been able to evade, and to which all white nations of the present must inevitably succumb. Anyone who announces its end, or believes that he has overcome it, is simply incapable of understanding it. Its most forceful decades are only now setting in on us. Every leading personality in the age of the Gracchen Revolution, Scipio as much as his opponent Hannibal, Sulla no less than Marius. Every great event, the fall of Carthage, the Spanish Wars, the revolt of the Italian allies, and the slave revolts from Sicily to Asia Minor, are simply forms in which this deep inward crisis of society, the organic structure of the culture peoples, moves towards its fulfillment. It was the same in Egypt of the Hyksos period, in the China of the contending states, and everywhere else in the contemporary section of history, little as we may know about it. In this respect, we are all slaves of history's will, the organs of an organic happening, working with it and for it. And, as Schiller says, he who would set out to manage it prudently must himself train it towards its non-fulfillment. In this tremendous duel between major tendencies, which is being fought throughout the white world in wars, revolutions, strong personalities that are vessels of high success and deep tragedy, powerful but fugitive creations. The offensive comes at present from below, from the city masses, and the defensive from above is still feeble and lacks the good conscience which necessity brings. The end will be in sight only when the relation is inverted, and this is near at hand. In such times there are, under whatever names, two natural parties, two fronts in the class war, two infernal forces and tendencies, and only two, no matter how many party organizations exist or whether such exist at all. There is proof of this in the progressive Bolshevization of the masses in the United States, in the Russian style that informs thoughts, hopes, and wishes. That is a party. So far, there is no focus of resistance against it in that country, which has no yesterday, and perhaps no morrow. The brilliant episode of the dollar and dollar society, starting from the War of Secession's end in 1865, seems to be approaching its end. Will Chicago be the Moscow of the New World? In England, the Oxford Union, which is the principal students' club of the most aristocratic university in the country, has passed by a sweeping majority the resolution, quote, that this House will in no circumstances fight for king and country, unquote. What this signifies is the end of the mentality, which has up till now reigned among all party formations. It is not impossible that the Anglo-Saxon powers are beginning to fade out. And the West European continent? The country least troubled with its white Bolshevism is Russia, which has no longer any party, but a governing, quote, horde, unquote, of the old Asiatic type under that name. Neither is there any longer faith in a program. There is only the fear of death, through being deprived of one's food card or one's pass, banishment to a labor camp, bullet, or rope. Vainly, in their cowardice, whole classes of society seek a conciliatory middle course between radical tendencies of right and left. The age itself is radical. It will have no compromises. There is no doing away with or denying the fact of the existing superiority of the left, or the awakening will to a right movement, which for the present has a footing only in closed circles, in certain armies, and among other places, in the English House of Lords. That is why the English Liberal Party has vanished, and why its heir, the Labour Party, will also vanish in its present form. That is why the centre parties in Germany vanished without resistance. The will to a middle way is the senile wish for peace at any price, for a Switzerland of nations, for historical abdication, as if thereby the blows of history could be avoided. The opposition of a graded social structure and town masses, of tradition and Bolshevism, of the higher existence of the few and the lower of mass labor, however labeled, is upon us. There is no third alternative. But it is just as much an error to believe in the possibility of a single party. Parties are liberal democratic forms of opposition. They presuppose a counterparty. One party is as impossible in a state as is one state in a stateless world. The political frontier, of country or mentality, always separates two powers from one another. It is the infantile disease of all revolutions, this belief in a triumphant unity, when in fact the problem of the age, from which they themselves spring, demands discord. Not in this way are the great problems of history to be solved. They must and will mature, and so pass on to new problems, new battles. The total state, an Italian catchword which has an international vogue, was realized by the Jacobins during the 2 years of the Terror. But as soon as they had annihilated the fallen powers of the old regime and founded the dictatorship, they split up themselves into Girondists and Montagnards, and the first named of these occupied the place left vacant. Their leaders fell victims to the left, but their successors in turn treated the left in the same way. Then, with Thermidor, They're set in the period of waiting for a successful general. It is possible to destroy a party insofar as it consists of an organization and a bureaucracy of salaried officials, but not one which is a movement, a spiritual and intellectual force. The struggle, which is a necessity of nature, is merely transferred within the surviving party, in which two fronts will be formed to carry it on. The fact may be gainsaid or covered up, but it is there. This is true of fascism and of every other of the many movements after the fascist model that have arisen, or, as say in America, are arising. Here every individual is confronted with an inevitable choice. It behooves him to know definitively where he stands, on the right or the left. Otherwise, the course of history, which is stronger than all theory and ideological dreaming, will decide for him. Conciliation is as impossible today as it was in the time of the Gracchi. Western Bolshevism is dead nowhere, except in Russia. Its fighting organizations may be destroyed, but it lives on in new forms, as left wing of the party, which thinks it has conquered it, as a mentality as to the existence of which, in their own thought, individuals and masses alike are capable of complete self-deception, and as a movement that breaks out suddenly one day in organized forms. What do we mean by, quote, left, unquote? Last century's catchwords such as socialism, Marxism, communism are out of date. They no longer mean anything. We use them to avoid disclosing where we really stand. But the age demands clarity. Left is party, is what believes in parties, for this is a liberal form of the fight against high society, of class war since 1770, of the longing for majorities, for all to be in the running, for quantity instead of quality, for the herd against the master. But the true Caesarism of all declining culture takes its stand upon small, strong minorities. Left is that which has a program, for a program presupposes an intellectual, rationalistic, and romantic belief in the power to control reality by abstractions. Left is the noisy agitation at the street corners and in public meetings, the art of overthrowing city crowds by strong words and weak arguments. It was in the time of the Gracchi that Latin prose developed into that oratorical style which is good for nothing but the hair-splitting rhetoric which we find in Cicero. Left is the enthusiasm for mass in general as a foundation for one's individual power, the will to level everything distinctive, to equate the artisan with the people, while casting derisive side glances at the peasantry and bourgeoisie. A party is not only antiquated as a form, its basis is also a mass ideology that is already antiquated. It sees things from below. It runs after the thought of the majority. Left is, finally and above all, lack of respect for property, although no race has so strong an instinct of possession as the Germanic, and that precisely because it has been the strongest willed of all historical races. Will to possession is the Nordic meaning of life. It controls and shapes our whole history, commencing from the conquering expeditions of semi-mythical kings down to the form of the family at the present day, which dies when the idea of property fades out. Where the instinct for this is lacking, race is not. The great danger for the coming middle of our century lies in this, that we are prolonging the life of that which we could overthrow. It is a generation of semi-solutions and transitions. But as long as this is possible, the revolution is not at an end. The Caesarism of the future will not persuade, it will conquer by force of arms. Only when all this has become self-evident, when we feel majorities to be a pretext and despise them, when someone arises who is able to look down upon the mass, on party in every sense of the word, and on all programs and ideologies, Only then will the revolution have been overcome. Even in fascism, there exists the Grockin fact of two fronts. On the left, the lower-class town population, and on the right, the nation graded up from peasantry to ruling classes. But this fact is kept under by the Napoleonic vigor of one individual. This polarity is not, and cannot be, liquidated, and it will emerge again, the moment when this iron hand leaves the helm, in the bitter struggles of his diadochi. For fascism is also a transition. It has its origins in the city mobs, and began as a masked party, with noise and disturbance and mass oratory. Labor socialist tendencies are not unknown to it. But so long as a dictatorship has, quote, social service, unquote, ambitions, asserts that it is there for the workers' sake, courts favor in the streets, and is popular, so long it remains an interim form. The Caesarism of the future fights solely for power, for empire, and against every description of party. Every ideological movement believes in the definitiveness of its achievements. It repudiates the idea that, after it, history should go on. It still lacks the Caesarian skepticism and contempt for humanity, the deep sense of the fleetingness of all phenomena. Mussolini's creative idea was grand, and it has had an international effect. It revealed a possible form for the combating of Bolshevism. But this form arose out of imitating the enemy, and is therefore full of dangers. Revolution from below, organized and participated in for the greater part by men from below. An armed party militia, paralleled in Caesar's Rome by the bands of Clodius and Milo. The tendency to subordinate intellectual and economic leadership to executive working out, because of inability to understand it. To disregard others' property, to confuse the conceptions of nation and mass. In a word, the socialistic ideology of last century. This all belongs to the past. What anticipates the future is not the being of fascism as a party, but simply and solely the figure of its creator. Mussolini is no party leader, although he was formerly a labor leader. He is the lord of his country. Probably his prototype Lenin would also have arrived at that point had he lived longer, for he certainly had a cool ruthlessness vis-a-vis his party, and he had also the courage to lead the retreat from ideologies of every kind. Mussolini is first and foremost a statesman, ice-cold and skeptical, realist, diplomat. He does, in very truth, rule alone. He sees everything, and that is the rarest gift in an absolute ruler. Even Napoleon was isolated by his entourage. The most difficult victories of a ruler, and the most essential, are not those won over enemies, but those won over his own supporters, the Praetorians, the Ras, as they are called in Italy. That is the best of the born ruler. He who does not know this, and has neither the power nor the courage for it, swims like a cork on the waves, on the summit, and yet impotent. The perfection of Caesarism is dictatorship, not the dictatorship of a party, but that of one man against all parties, and, most of all, above his own. Every revolutionary movement reaches its victory with a vanguard of Praetorians, who are henceforth of no more use, but merely dangerous. The real master is known by the manner in which he dismisses them, ruthlessly and without thanks, intent only on his goal, to reach which he must first pick his men, and this he knows how to do. The French Revolution ran contrary to this in the beginning. No one had the power, everyone wanted it. Everyone commanded, no one obeyed. Mussolini is a master man, with the southern cunning of the race in him, like the condottieri of the Renaissance, and is therefore able to stage his movement in entire continents with the character of Italy, home of opera, without ever being intoxicated by it himself, though even Napoleon was not quite free from this weakness, and in the case of Rienzi, for instance, it was fatal. When Mussolini appeals to the Prussian archetype, he is right. He is far less closely related to Napoleon than to Frederick the Great, and even to Frederick's father. I have now reached the point where the definitive word must be said about Prussianism and socialism. In 1919, I compared the two, the one a living idea, and the other the catchword of a whole century. And was, I am tempted to add, of course, not understood. People no longer know how to read. This great art, still known in the age of Goethe, has died out. They skim printed pages, mass-wise, and, as a rule, the reader demoralizes the book. I showed that in the working class, as Bebel welded it into a powerful army, in its discipline and loyal subordination, its good comradeship, its readiness for the ultimate sacrifice, there still lived that old Prussian style, which first proved itself in the battles of the 7 Years' War. What mattered then was the individual socialist as a character, his moral imperative, not the socialism hammered into his head, which was a wholly un-Prussian mixture of foolish ideology and vulgar greed. I pointed out also that this type of being in form for a task was a tradition going back to the Teutonic Order, by which the Gothic centuries, as again today, the frontier guard of the Faustian culture was kept up against Asia. This ethical attitude, unconscious as is every genuine lifestyle, and therefore to be awakened and trained only by a living example and not by talk and writing, stood forth in its splendor in August 1914. The army had trained Germany, and was betrayed by the parties in 1918, when the state went under. Since then, this disciplined will has again raised its head in the national movement, not in its programs and parties, but in the ethical attitude of an elite, as individuals. And it is possible that, starting from this foundation, the German people may by perseverance be slowly trained for its difficult future. This is essential if we are not to succumb in the battles that lie ahead. But the shallow-minded cannot get away from the Marxian thought of the last century. Throughout the world, they think of socialism not as a moral attitude of life, but as economic socialism, labor socialism, as a mass ideology with material aims. Program socialism of every sort is thinking from below, building on base instincts, canonizing the herd feeling which everywhere today lurks behind the slogan of, quote, overcoming individualism, unquote. It is the contrary of Prussian feeling, which has livingly experienced through exemplary leaders the necessity of disciplined devotion, and possesses accordingly the inward freedom that comes with fulfillment of duty, the ordering of oneself, command of oneself, for the sake of a great aim. Labor socialism in every form, on the other hand, is, as I have already shown, definitively English in origin. It arose about 1840, simultaneously with the victory of the Joint Stock Company and the rootless financial form of capital. Both were the expression of free trade Manchesterism. This, quote, white, unquote, Bolshevism is capitalism from below, wage capitalism, just as speculative finance capital, in respect of its methods, is socialism from above, from the stock exchange. Both grew out of the same intellectual root, thinking in money, trading in money on the pavements of the world's capitals, whether as wage levels or profits on exchange rates, make no odds. There is no contradiction between economic liberalism and socialism. The labor market is the stock exchange of the organized proletariat. The trade unions are trusts for forcing up wages on the lines followed by oil, steel, and bank trusts of the Anglo-American type, whose finance socialism penetrates, dominates, sucks, and controls them to the point of systematic economic expropriation. The devastating, dispossessing effect of bundles of shares and bonds, the separation of mere credit from the responsible directive work of the entrepreneur, who no longer knows to whom his work actually belongs, has not received anything like adequate consideration. Productive economy is in the last resort nothing but the will-less object of stock exchange maneuvers. It was only the rise of the share system to domination that enabled the stock exchange, formerly a mere aid to economy, to assume the decisive control of economic life. Finance socialists and trust magnates like Morgan and Kruger correspond absolutely to the mass leaders of labor parties and to the Russian economic commissars, dealer natures with the same parvenu tastes. From both sides, today as in the days of the Gracchi, the conservative forces of the state, army, property, peasant, and manager, are being attacked. But the Prussian style demands not only a mere precedence of higher policy over economics. It demands that the economic life should be disciplined by a powerful state, which is the precondition of free initiative in private enterprise. For, whatever else it may be, it is not a mere super party, complete with program and ready to press organization to the point of abolishing the ideal of property, Eigentum, which, precisely among Germanic peoples, denotes freedom of economic will, and lordship over that which is one's own. Disciplining is the training of a racehorse by an experienced rider, and not the forcing of the living economic body into the straitjacket of an economic plan, or its transformation into a press-the-button machine. Prussian is also the aristocratic ordering of life according to the grade of achievement. Prussian is, above all, the undisputed precedence of foreign policy, the successful steering of the state in a world of states, over internal policy, which exists solely to keep the nation informed for this task, and becomes mischievous and criminal as soon as it begins to follow independently its own ideological aims. Herein lies the weakness of most revolutions, whose leaders, having risen through demagogy and learned nothing else, are unable to find their way from thinking on party lines to thinking in terms of statesmanship. This was the case with Danton and Robespierre. Mirabeau and Lenin died too soon, while Mussolini was successful. But the future belongs to the great fact men, now that the world improvers, who have preened themselves on the stage of world history since Rousseau, have vanished and left no trace. Prussian is, lastly, a character which disciplines itself, such as that of Frederick the Great, which he himself paraphrased as consisting in being the first servant of the state. Such a servant is no lackey, but when Bebel opined that the German people had the soul of a lackey, he was right as far as the majority were concerned. His own party proved it in 1918. The lackeys of success are more numerous with us than elsewhere, although they have in all ages and all nations crowded the herd of humanity. It is a matter of indifference whether Byzantinism performs its orgies before money bags, political success, a title, or merely Gessler's hat. When Charles II landed in England, there were suddenly no republicans left. To be a servant of the state is an aristocratic value, of which few are possessed. If this is socialistic, it is a proud and exclusive socialism for men of race, or the elect of life. Prussianism is a very superior thing, which sets itself against every sort of majority and mob rule, above all against the dominance of the mass character. Moltke, the great educator of the German officer, the finest example of true Prussianism in the 19th century, was thus constituted. Count Schlieffen summed up his personality in the motto, quote, "Talk little, do much, be rather than seem." Unquote. This idea of a, quote, Prussian, unquote, existence will be the starting point for the ultimate overcoming of the world revolution. There is no other possibility. I said, as far back as 1919, not everyone is a Prussian who is born in Prussia. The type is possible anywhere in the white world, and actually occurs, though rarely. It lies at the root of the provisional form of national movements everywhere. There is nothing definitive about them, and the question is to what extent it can be liberated from the quickly aging, popular, party-democratic elements of liberal and socialist nationalism that control it for the time being. The silent national feeling of the English about 1900 which today has begun to waver. The boastful, shallow chauvinism of the French, so noisily in evidence in the Dreyfus affair, were both of this order, and found support, the one in the cult of the Navy, the other in the Army. America possesses nothing of this kind. Quote, 100% American, unquote, is a phrase, but she needs it if she is to endure as a nation at all after the approaching clash between crouching communism and the high finance, which is already undermined. The Prussian idea is opposed to finance liberalism, as well as to labor socialism. Every description of mass and majority, everything that is left, it regards as suspect. Above all, it is opposed to any weakening of the state, and to the desecrating misuse of it for economic interests. It is conservative and right, and it grows out of whatever fundamental life forces still exist in Nordic peoples. Instinct for power and possessions, for possessions as power, for inheritance, fecundity and family, which three belong together, for distinctions of rank and social gradation, whose mortal enemy was, or is, rationalism from 1750 to 1950. Present-day nationalism is, together with the monarchical idea latent in it, a transition. It is a preliminary step towards Caesarism, no matter how far away that may seem. It is there that we find abhorrence of all liberal and socialist party systems, of every kind of popularity, which invariably comprises the object of it, of everything which rises up in masses and will have its say. This trait, though it may be buried deep under the tendencies more in keeping with the age, has the future on its side, and the future's leaders. All really great leaders in history go, quote, right, unquote, however low the depths from which they have climbed. It is the mark of the born master and ruler. This applies to Cromwell and Mirabeau as much as to Napoleon. The riper the age, the more prospects does this road open up. The elder Scipio went under in the conflict between the traditions of his origins, which forbade an illegal dictatorship, and the historical position which he had obtained, without desiring it, through saving Rome from the Carthaginian danger. He died in a distant land. At that time, the revolutionary movement was only just beginning to undermine the tradition-bound forms, so that the younger Scipio had still a very weak position against the Gracchi, but Sulla's was already a very strong one against Marius. And finally Caesar, who had begun as a Catilinarian, met with no more party opposition at all, for the Pompeians were not a party, but supporters of an individual. The world revolution, strong as it may be at the beginning, ends not in victory or defeat, but in resignation on the part of the forward-driven masses. Their ideals are not refuted, but merely become boring, and eventually no one can be brought to get excited about them. Anyone who talks about the end of the bourgeoisie writes himself down as still a proletarian, and the future is not for him. A non-bourgeois society can be maintained only by a terror, and only for a few years at that, for presently people are sick of it. And incidentally, the labor leaders will meanwhile have become new bourgeoisie. This is not a process that appeals to the taste of true leader natures. Socialism of every kind is today as antiquated as its first liberal form, and as everything else that is connected with the party and program. The century of the worker cult, 1840 to 1940, is irrevocably ending, and those who acclaim the worker at this stage have no understanding of the time. This worker is stepping back into the whole of the nation, no longer as its spoiled nursling, but as the lowest grade in an urban society. The contrasts worked up in the class war will again become the permanent differences of high and low, and will be accepted as such. It is the resignation of the imperial period in Rome, the period in which there were no economic problems of this nature left. But how much can be destroyed and leveled down in the final stages of world anarchy? So much, indeed, that in certain white nations there will be no material left which a Caesar could create his structure, his army, for armies will in the future take the place of parties, and his state. Is there, in that which all white countries that took part in the war calls itself, vaguely enough, youth, and the front generation, anything like a weight-carrying foundation for such men and for the tasks of the future? The profound shock of the Great War, which swept away everyone's lazy illusions of security and of progress being the meaning of history, is nowhere more evident than in the spiritual chaos left in its wake. The fact that we are not in the least aware of this, and believe that we carry within us a new order, is the best possible proof of its existence. To those who were born about 1890, the sight of a really commanding figure has been denied. The figures of Bismarck and Moltke, not to speak of those of other countries, had already vanished into the midst of a historical literature. They might have formed a standard for real greatness, but not without a living present. And the war produced not one important monarch, prominent statesman, or victorious battle thinker as the decisive point. All the statuses and street names in the world will not change that fact. The result was a complete lack of the sense of authority among the millions who returned home, on both sides. It was seen in the youth's unrestrained criticism of everything that came to hand, of men and of things, while never a trace of self-criticism was seen. It laughed at yesterday, without suspecting that its power perished. Most of all, the chaos manifested itself in a way in which everyone screamed for a dictatorship on his own lines, without knowing of any dictator or being able to recognize one, in the way in which a leader was chosen and worshipped one day and rejected the next. Primo de Rivera, D'Annunzio, Ludendorff, and the way in which leadership was a problem to be discussed, not a fact to be waited for and accepted from the moment it was there. Political dilettantism talked large. Everyone wrote to tell his future dictator what he ought to do. Everyone demanded discipline from other people, because he was incapable of disciplining himself. Because they had forgotten what a state's governor is, men became hysterical over programs and ideals, and plunged into speech and writing, into wild dreams of this and that imperative transformation, assuming quite as a matter of course that such were possible. The lack of respect for history has at no time been greater than in these years. That history has its own logic, on which all programs are shipwrecked, no one knew or would admit. But Bismarck attained his end because he had comprehended the course of history in his century and adapted himself to it. That was high policy, the art of the possible. From the youth of Germany, England, Spain, all the white countries, who in their incomprehension hoped to end a 2 centuries process of world change from below, and in the form of Bolshevism, of which they had such store in themselves, came the typical revolutionary outcry against individualism. But they are all small individuals, very small, without talent or depth, but for that very reason, obsessed by the convulsive need to be admittedly right. They therefore hated the superiority of people greater than themselves, men who could regard themselves with at least a tinge of skepticism. All revolutionaries are humorless, and this causes their fall. Petty obstinacy and lack of humor, that is the definition of fanaticism. They were quite unaware that leadership, authority, and respect on the one hand, and socialism on the other, are irreconcilable. This anti-individualism is the theoretical fashion of the moment among intellectuals, in spite of themselves, of all white countries. Yesterday it was individualism that was the mode, and as a matter of fact, there is not so much difference between the two. Feeble as is this type of Geist, it is the only one they possess. It is the megalopolitan literariness, nothing more, and anything but novel. For the Jacobins had already talked themselves hoarse over it. Lack of intelligence is not quite a good enough weapon wherewith to defeat rationalism. And in what does it consist, the socialism of these heroes who would take the field against the freedom of personality? It is the impersonal Asiatic collectivism of the East, the spirit of the Great Plains in association with the Western levée en masse of 1792. And what, in fact, is it that is in revolt? The significant, with number as their sole power. There is a great deal of underground Slav in them, remnants of prehistoric races and their primitive reasoning. Envy, too, of Russianness, whose undeveloped will exempts it from the torment which possesses inferior minds when they want to do something but no longer know what, are obliged to want it and do not dare. He who has not the courage to be the hammer must be content to play the part of the anvil. The part is not without its consolations. The urge to be released from one's own will, to be submerged in the lazy majority, to know the happiness of a lackey's soul, to be spared the master's anxieties. All this is here disguised under big words. The romanticism of the insignificant, the apotheosis of the herd feeling, the last final way to idealize one's own dread of responsibility. This kind of hatred of individualism, arising out of cowardice and shame, is a mere caricature of that of the great 14th and 15th century mystics, with their anti-egoism, the Lassen der Ichheit, of the Theologie Deutsch. They were strong souls, who livingly experienced the tremendous, truly Germanic solitude of the I in the world, and out of their torment conceived the burning desire to go up in God, or the All, or whatever they might call it, and which turned out, in fact, to be themselves. The strong, unbending I was their destiny. Every attempt to overstep its boundary merely showed that it had none. Today there is a simpler method. One turns socialist and runs down the I of other people. One's own I gives no more trouble. The leveling out of brains is complete. One meets the mass, wills in the mass, thinks in the mass. Those who do not think with it, who think for themselves, are felt to be enemies. It is now the mass, and not the Godhead, in which the lazy, stupid I, suffering from all manner of inhibitions, submerges itself. And that too is release. It is almost mystical. They knew that in 1792. It is the craving of the mob to run and act with the rest. But the Prussian style is renunciation by one's own free will, the strong I bowing before a great duty and task, an act of self-government, and, as such, the height in individualism that is possible in the present. The Celtic Germanic race is the strongest will that the world has ever seen. But this I will, which fills the Faustian soul to the brim, which is the ultimate meaning of its being, and controls every expression of its culture and thought, deeds and standards, awakened also the consciousness of the I's, complete loneliness in endless space. Will and loneliness are in the last resort the same thing. Hence Moltke's taciturnity, and, from another aspect, the need in Goethe's softer and more feminine nature for perpetual confessions before a self-chosen environment which pervades all his works. It was the yearning for an echo out of space, the suffering of a tender soul from the monologue of its existence. One may pride oneself on this loneliness or suffer from it. Escape it, one cannot. The religious man of eternal truths, such as Luther, sighs for grace and salvation from this fate, fights it, even defies it. But the political man of the North develops out of it a gigantic defiance of reality. Thy trust is in thy sword more than in Thor, says an Icelandic saga. If there is such a thing as individualism in the world, it is this of an individual defying a whole universe, his knowledge of his own unbending will, his delight in ultimate decisions and love of destiny itself, even at the moment when it is breaking him. And being Prussian consists in bending of one's own free will. The worth of the sacrifice lies in the fact that it is hard. If a man has no I to offer up, he should not talk of loyalty. He merely runs along behind someone onto whom he has shifted the responsibility. If there is anything that should amaze us today, it is the poverty of the socialist ideal by which it is hoped to save the world. This is no release from the forces of the past. It is the continuation of their worst tendencies. It is cowardice in the face of life. Truly Prussian loyalty is what the world most needs in this age of great catastrophes. We can only lean on what offers resistance. It is only on the realization of this that the true leader takes his stand. A leader who has risen from the masses must know, better than most, that masses, majorities, parties are no genuine liegemen. They merely want advantages. They leave their leader in the lurch as soon as he demands sacrifices. If he thinks and feels as a product of the mass, history will treat him as a mere demagogue. It is a parting of the ways to left and right. The demagogue lives with the masses always as one of themselves. The born ruler can use them, but he despises them. He fights his most difficult battles not against enemy, but against the swarm of his all too devoted friends. That is why armies, and not parties, are the future form of power. Unselfish, devoted armies, such as Napoleon never possessed after Wagram. His old soldiers were reliable, not so his senior officers. And the value of any army depends in the first place on these. They came to regard him not as the commander, but as the perpetual giver. Once the required sacrifices outweighed the advantages, it was all up with the Grand Army. It is high time that the white world, and Germany in the first place, should consider these facts. For behind the world wars and the still unfinished proletarian world revolution, there looms the greatest of all dangers, the colored menace. And it will require every bit of race that is still available among white nations to deal with it. Germany, of all countries, is not an island, as the political ideologues who would make it the object of their programs seem to imagine. It is but a small spot in a great, fermenting world, though undoubtedly a spot in a decisive position. But it alone has Prussianism as a fact within itself. With this treasure of exemplary being, it may become the educator of the white world, and perhaps its savior.